Imagine the quiet charm of St. Mary Mead shattered by a web of whispers and shadows. What if a simple glance from an elderly spinster could expose a deadly conspiracy lurking among trusted friends? In Miss Marple's sharp glance that unraveled a secret pact, the astute Miss Jane Marple stumbles upon an anonymous note hinting at a hidden agreement among the village elite. A greedy plot to sell sacred land for personal gain, sealed in secrecy at late-night meetings. But when wealthy newcomer Mr. Ellison is poisoned in his study, and Dr. Haydock's assistant tumbles down the stairs in a suspicious accident, questions explode like thunder. Who among the council members, from the ambitious doctor to the debt-ridden colonel, would kill to protect their fortune? Why does the mysterious historian Mr. Weaver prowl the shadows, and what deadly secrets hide in a locked ledger of coded betrayals? As Miss Marple's knitting needles click like a ticking clock, she draws parallels to past village scandals, piecing together clues from overheard whispers, rare poisonous flowers, and a crumpled note clutched in a dying hand. Will her razor-sharp observation dismantle the pact before another life is claimed, restoring peace to the deceptively serene St. Mary Mead, or will greed's poison claim her as its next victim? Dive into this Agatha Christie-inspired tale of human nature's darkest twists, where every neighbor hides a motive, and one woman's glance unravels it all. Chapter 1. A quiet morning in St. Mary Mead. The sun had barely crested the gentle hills surrounding St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow over the thatched roofs and tidy gardens that define the village's timeless charm. Miss Jane Marple, seated in her favorite wicker chair by the window of her modest cottage, sipped her morning tea with the delicate precision of habit. Her knitting lay across her lap, a soft tangle of pale pink wool that grew steadily under her nimble fingers. From her vantage point, she could see the comings and goings of the village, a quiet symphony of routine that she had observed for decades. The butcher's boy cycled past, whistling a tune, his basket laden with parcels wrapped in brown paper. Mrs. Price, her neighbor, was already out tending her roses, her straw hat bobbing as she snipped at errant stems. It was, to all appearances, an ordinary morning in St. Mary Mead. But Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes missed nothing, and her mind, ever alert, was already turning over a small, curious detail that Mrs. Price, pausing in her gardening, had called out a greeting to Miss Marple through the open window, her voice carrying the cheerful briskness of early summer. "Good morning, Miss Marple. Fine day for the fete preparations, isn't it? Though I heard something odd at the village hall last night, some sort of secret meeting, if you can believe it." Her tone had been light, almost gossipy, but it was the kind of remark that lodged itself in Miss Marple's mind like a burr. A secret meeting in St. Mary Mead? The village was not known for its secrets, at least not the kind that stayed hidden for long. People here were too fond of talking, and Miss Marple, with her knack for listening, had always found that the smallest snippets of conversation could unravel the most intricate of mysteries. She set her teacup down on the lace doily that adorned her side table and picked up her knitting, her fingers moving automatically as her thoughts wandered. A secret meeting at the village hall was unusual, to say the least. The hall was the heart of St. Mary Mead's community life, a place for whist drives, amateur dramatics, and the occasional heated debate over parish matters. It was not a place for clandestine gatherings. Miss Marple's mind flicked back to a similar incident some years ago, when a group of villagers had met in secret to discuss the sale of a local meadow. That affair had ended in scandal, with accusations of profiteering and a rather unfortunate incident involving a forged signature. Could this be something similar? Or was it merely a misunderstanding, a harmless gathering exaggerated by Mrs. Price's love of drama? The village was abuzz with preparations for the upcoming charity fete, an annual event that brought St. Mary Mead together in a flurry of bunting, cake stalls, and good-natured competition. This year's fete was to raise funds for the restoration of the church roof, a cause that had united even the most fractious villagers. Miss Marple had already promised to contribute a knitted shawl for the raffle, and she was looking forward to the event, if only for the opportunity to observe her neighbors. People, she had long ago learned, revealed their true selves in the small moments when they thought no one was watching, or when their guard was lowered by the distractions of a fete. As she knitted, her eyes drifted to the street where Colonel Bantry, one of the village's more prominent figures, was striding purposefully toward the village hall. His military bearing was unmistakable, though his shoulders seemed a little more stooped than usual, and his face bore a frown that suggested preoccupation. Miss Marple noted this with interest. Colonel Bantry was a member of the village council. Alongside Dr. Haydock, the local physician, and a newcomer to St. Mary Mead, Mr. Ellison, a wealthy businessman who had recently purchased the grand old manor on the edge of the village. The council was responsible for organizing the fete, among other things, and Miss Marple wondered if Colonel Bantry's troubled expression had anything to do with Mrs. Price's mysterious meeting. Her thoughts were interrupted by the arrival of her maid, Florence, a sturdy young woman with a no-nonsense manner and a tendency to hum hymns under her breath. "Morning, Miss Marple," Florence said, setting a tray of fresh scones on the table. "Mrs. Price was just telling me about some goings-on at the hall last night. Said it was all very hush-hush, with the curtains drawn and voices kept low. Sounds like something out of one of those detective stories you're so fond of." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Does it, Florence?" "I'm sure. It's nothing so dramatic. Probably just the council discussing the fate arrangements." But her tone was measured, and her eyes twinkled with a curiosity that belied her words. Florence, accustomed to her employer's understated ways, merely nodded and returned to the kitchen, leaving Miss Marple to her thoughts. The morning passed quietly, with Miss Marple dividing her time between her knitting and her observations of the village. She noted the comings and goings at the vicarage, where the young vicar, Mr. Clement, was overseeing the delivery of tables for the fete. She saw Mrs. Price pause to chat with Miss Hartnell, another of St. Mary Mead's more vocal residents, their heads bent together in what was surely an exchange of gossip. And she watched as a sleek black car, unfamiliar to the village, pulled up outside Mr. Ellison's manor. A man stepped out, tall and thin, with a nervous air that Miss Marple found instantly intriguing. He carried a briefcase and glanced around as if expecting to be watched, then hurried up the manor steps and disappeared inside. By midday, Miss Marple had decided that the fete would be the perfect opportunity to learn more about the so-called secret meeting. She had always found that people were at their most unguarded during such events, distracted by the bustle and cheer. If there was indeed a pact or conspiracy afoot, as Mrs. Price's remark suggested, the fete would provide ample opportunity to observe the key players, Colonel Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Mr. Ellison, and perhaps even the mysterious stranger from the black car. Miss Marple's sharp glance, honed by years of watching and listening, would miss nothing. She rose from her chair, setting her knitting aside, and crossed to her writing desk to pen a note to her friend Dolly Bantry, Colonel Bantry's wife. Dolly was a warm, garrulous woman who could always be relied upon for the latest village news, even if her accounts were sometimes colored by her flair for the dramatic. Miss Marple's note was brief but pointed, expressing her excitement for Avon, the fate, and casually inquiring about the council's preparations. If anyone knew what her husband was up to, it would be Dolly Dot as she sealed the envelope. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the anonymous note Mrs. Price had mentioned, the one found in the village gazette. It had been a small thing, easily overlooked, but its wording had been peculiar. The pact will hold, but at what cost? Miss Marple had not seen the gazette herself, but Mrs. Price had quoted the phrase with relish, and it had struck Miss Marple as deliberately cryptic, as if meant to provoke speculation. She made a mental note to ask Mr. Clement for a copy of the gazette later that day. If there was a pact, as the note suggested, it was likely tied to something of value-land, money, or perhaps influence. St. Mary Mead, for all its sleepy charm, was not immune to the temptations of greed or ambition. The afternoon brought a gentle breeze, stirring the curtains and carrying the scent of lavender from Miss Marple's garden. She stepped outside to tend her roses, her movements slow but purposeful. As she pruned, she kept an eye on the street, noting the arrival of Dr. Haydock, who stopped to speak with Colonel Bantry outside the village hall. Their conversation appeared animated, with Colonel Bantry gesturing emphatically and Dr. Haydock nodding, his face grave. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. She had always found Dr. Haydock to be a man of strong opinions, quick to assert his authority on council matters, but there was something in his demeanor today that suggested unease. By evening, the village had settled into its usual rhythm, the golden light of late afternoon giving way to the soft glow of lamps in cottage windows. Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting once again in her hands, but her mind was far from idle. She thought of the anonymous note, the secret meeting, the stranger at the manor, and the troubled expressions of the council members. There was a pattern here, she was certain, though it was still too faint to discern fully. She recalled a case from her youth, when a group of villagers in a neighboring parish had conspired to falsify records for profit. The signs had been subtle then, to a whispered conversation, a misplaced document, a glance that lingered too long. Miss Marple had learned to trust such signs, for they often led to the heart of a mystery. As the clock struck 7, Florence appeared with a tray of tea and biscuits, her face alight with news. "Miss Marple, you'll never guess what I heard at the shop just now," she said, setting the tray down. "Clara, the housemaid up at Mr. Ellison's manor, says she saw lights burning late last night and voices coming from the study. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but she swears it wasn't just Mr. Ellison and his staff. There were others there, and they sounded angry." Chapter 2. The curious invitation. The morning sun cast a golden glow over St. Mary Mead, filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's modest cottage. She sat in her favorite armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. Her eyes, sharp and bright despite her age, darted occasionally to the garden outside, where the roses were in full bloom and the sparrows flitted about with their usual chatter. It was a scene of perfect tranquility, the kind that St. Mary Mead was known for, but Miss Marple knew better than most that beneath such calm surfaces Secrets often stirred. She had just finished a row of stitches when a rustle at the gate caught her attention. It was the postman, young Tommy Pierce, who waved cheerily as he slipped a few envelopes through the letterbox. Miss Marple set her knitting aside and rose, her movements slow but deliberate, to retrieve the mail. Among the usual bills and a letter from her nephew Raymond, there was something unusual: the weekly Village Gazette, a thin pamphlet that usually contained little more than notices about bake sales and church events. But today, tucked between the pages, was a small, handwritten note, folded neatly and unsealed. Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly as she unfolded it. The handwriting was unfamiliar, scrawled in black ink with a hurried, almost careless flourish. The message was brief but intriguing. The pact is sealed, but not all are true. Watch the hall where shadows meet. No signature, no address, just those cryptic words. She turned the paper over, examining it for any clue: a smudge of ink, a crease that might suggest its origin, but there was nothing. Her fingers lingered on the note as her mind began to work, piecing together possibilities like the stitches of her knitting. A pact, she murmured to herself, her voice soft but laced with curiosity. The word suggested secrecy, an agreement, hidden from the light of day, and the mention of the village hall, that unassuming building at the heart of St. Mary Mead, only deepened her interest. She recalled a time, years ago, when a similar note had arrived in the village, hinting at a scandal among the church choir. That had turned out to be a matter of petty theft, but the memory sharpened her senses now. This note felt different, weightier, as if it carried the promise of something more sinister. She tucked the note into her pocket and returned to her knitting, but her thoughts were no longer on the shawl. The village hall was hosting preparations for the upcoming charity fete, a grand event that drew everyone from St. Mary Mead and even a few visitors from neighboring Much Benham. It was the perfect setting for secrets to surface, with so many people mingling, their guard lowered by the festive atmosphere. Miss Marple decided then and there that she would attend the fete, not just as a villager, but as an observer, her sharp glance ready to catch any hint of the pact the note described. The day of the fete dawned bright and clear, with a crisp autumn breeze carrying the scent of freshly baked scones and the faint hum of excitement. Miss Marple dressed carefully, choosing a tweed skirt and a lavender cardigan that gave her an air of harmless respectability. Her straw hat, adorned with a single silk rose, completed the ensemble, and she set off down the lane, her walking stick tapping lightly against the cobblestones. The village was alive with activity. Children darted about with streamers. Women from the Women's Institute bustled around trestle tables laden with jams and cakes, and the men were busy erecting a small stage for the afternoon's entertainment. As she approached the village green, Miss Marple's eyes scanned the crowd. There was Mrs. Price, her neighbor, fussing over a display of embroidered tablecloths. Colonel Bantry, red-faced and jovial, arguing good-naturedly with a vendor about the placement of a cider stall, and Dr. Haydock, the village physician, looking unusually preoccupied as he spoke in low tones to Mr. Ellison, the wealthy newcomer who had recently purchased the old manor on the edge of St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple noted the tension in Dr. Haydock's posture, the way his hand gripped his pipe a little too tightly, and the fleeting glance Mr. Ellison cast toward the village hall. It was a small thing, but to Miss Marple it was as telling as a shouted confession. She made her way to a bench. near the tea tent, where she could sit unobtrusively and watch the comings and goings. Her knitting was in her lap again, a useful prop that allowed her to appear absorbed while her eyes and ears missed nothing. She greeted passers-by with her usual gentle smile, exchanging pleasantries about the weather or the quality of Mrs. Clements. Marmalade, but her mind was elsewhere, sifting through the morning's observations. It was then that she overheard a snippet of conversation that made her pause. Colonel Bantry, standing just a few feet away with Dr. Haydock, was speaking in a low, urgent tone. "It's all arranged, Haydock," he said, his voice barely audible above the chatter of the crowd. "Ellison's agreed, but we must keep it quiet. No need to stir up trouble before the deal's done." Dr. Haydock nodded, his expression grim, and the two men moved off toward the village hall, their heads bent close together. Miss Marple's needles paused mid-stitch. A deal, she thought, and one that required secrecy. Could this be the pact the note referred to? Her mind flashed back to a case in her youth when a group of villagers had conspired to hide a theft of church funds. The signs had been similar: hushed conversations, furtive glances, and an air of unease that rippled beneath the village's cheerful facade. She resolved to keep a closer eye on the colonel and the doctor, and perhaps Mr. Ellison as well, whose arrival in St. Mary Mead had coincided with whispers of change. As the afternoon wore on, the fete grew livelier. A band struck up a merry tune, and children laughed as they played games of hoopla and coconut shy. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her eyes never straying far from the village hall. She noticed Clara, the young housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor, lingering near the edge of the green, her face pale and her hands twisting nervously in her apron. Miss Marple beckoned her over with a kind smile. "Clara, my dear," she said, patting the bench beside her, "you look troubled. Is everything all right at the manor?" Clara hesitated, glancing around as if afraid of being overheard, then sat down, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not right, Miss Marple," she said. "There's been strange goings-on at Mr. Ellison's place. Late-night meetings, with men coming and going after dark. I heard them talking about some sort of agreement, but I couldn't catch it all. And Mr. Ellison, he's been ever so cross lately, shouting at the staff for no reason." Her eyes widened with fear. "I think something's wrong, miss, but I daren't say more." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand reassuringly. "You've done well to tell me, Clara. Don't worry, I'll keep it to myself. But if you hear anything more, you come straight to me, won't you?" Clara nodded, relieved, and hurried back to her duties, leaving Miss Marple deep in thought. The mention of late-night meetings at the manor was another piece of the puzzle. Miss Marple recalled the coded note and its reference to shadows meeting at the hall. Could the manor be another meeting place, or was the hall the central hub of this mysterious pact? She thought of Mr. Ellison's wealth, his recent purchase of the manor, and the rumors that he planned to develop the land around it. Land, she knew, was often at the heart of village disputes, especially when money was involved. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple rose from her bench and made her way toward the village hall. The building was quiet now, the bustle of the fete having drawn most of the villagers to the green. She slipped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The hall was empty, save for a few scattered chairs and a table covered with papers from the fete's planning committee. She scanned the room, her sharp glance catching a small detail, a crumpled piece of paper tucked beneath a stack of flyers. She retrieved it carefully, smoothing it out. It was a list of names: Colonel Bantry, Dr. Haydock, Mr. Ellison, and a few others she recognized as members of the village council. Beside each name was a number, written in the same hurried hand as the note from the Gazette. The numbers varied, some in the hundreds, others in the thousands. A financial ledger, perhaps, or a record of contributions to the mysterious pact. Miss Marple folded the paper and slipped it into her handbag, her heart quickening with the thrill of discovery. Outside, the fete was winding down, the laughter and music fading as villagers began to head home. Miss Marple lingered by the hall's entrance, watching as Colonel Bantry and Dr. Haydock emerged, their faces drawn. They didn't notice her, standing quietly in the shadows, but she saw the way they glanced at each other, a shared understanding that spoke of secrets. Mr. Ellison followed a moment later, his expression unreadable as he hurried toward his car. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind racing. The note, the overheard conversation, Clara's story, and now the list of names all pointed to a conspiracy among some of St. Mary Mead's most respected citizens. But what was the nature of this pact, and why was it so carefully guarded? She thought of the village's history, of the small betrayals and hidden motives she had uncovered over the years. People, she knew, were rarely what they seemed, and even the most charming exterior could hide a heart driven by greed or fear. Chapter 3. Shadows at the Fattith. Sun hung high over St. Mary Mead, casting a golden glow across the village green where the annual charity fete was in full swing. Bunting fluttered in the gentle breeze, strung between ancient oaks and the steepled roof of the village hall. Stalls lined the grass, offering homemade jams, knitted scarves, and cakes baked by the Women's Institute. Children darted through the crowd, clutching toffee apples, their laughter mingling with the lively strains of a local brass band. The air carried the sweet scent of freshly cut grass and the faint tang of lemonade, a scene so quintessentially English that it might have been plucked from a postcard. Yet, to Miss Jane Marple, seated demurely on a wicker chair near the tea tent, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically, there was an undercurrent of unease rippling beneath the festive surface. Miss Marple's sharp blue eyes, undimmed by age, scanned the bustling crowd. She wore her usual attire, a black lace cap perched on her white hair, a tweed skirt, and a pale pink cardigan that seemed to defy the summer warmth. Her hands moved with practiced ease, the knitting a mere prop to mask her keen observation. To the casual onlooker, she was just an elderly spinster enjoying the fete, but her mind was as alert as ever, cataloging every detail, every glance, every whispered word. The anonymous note in the village gazette, hinting at a pact among prominent villagers, had set her senses tingling. She had seen such things before: secrets buried in plain sight, cloaked in the ordinariness of village life. And today, at the fete, she intended to watch closely. The village green was a microcosm of St. Mary Mead's social hierarchy. At the center of it all stood Colonel Bantry, his military bearing unmistakable even in civilian clothes. His tweed jacket strained slightly at the shoulders as he gestured animatedly, regaling a group of villagers with tales of his army days. His wife, Dolly Bantry, stood nearby, her cheerful laugh carrying over the crowd as she manned the cake stall. She was a dear friend of Miss Marple's, though prone to gossip, which often proved useful. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, was at the first aid tent, his gray hair catching the sunlight as he bandaged a child's scraped knee with professional efficiency. His manner was calm, but Miss Marple noted a certain distracted air about him, as if his thoughts were elsewhere. Then there was Mr. Ellison, the wealthy newcomer who had taken up residence at the Grand Ellison Manor 6 months prior. He stood apart, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, his dark eyes surveying the fete with a detached air. His arrival had stirred whispers, some admiring, some suspicious, but no one could deny his generosity. He had donated a hefty sum to the fete, ensuring its success. Miss Marple's attention lingered on these 3 men, the village council's most influential members. The note in the Gazette had been vague, but its implications were clear. A secret agreement existed, and these men were likely at its heart. She recalled Mrs. Price's comment from that morning about a secretive meeting at the village hall the previous week. They were in there till midnight, Mrs. Price had said, her tone laced with suspicion. And no one saying a word about it. Miss Marple had nodded politely, her mind already turning over possibilities. A pact could mean many things: financial dealings, personal vendettas, or something darker. Her years in St. Mary Mead had taught her that even the most idyllic villages harbored secrets. As she knitted, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a cluster of villagers near the tombola stall. Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was chatting with Miss Wetherby, whose sharp tongue was legendary. Their conversation seemed animated, but their eyes kept darting toward Mr. Ellison. Miss Marple made a mental note. Gossip, she knew, was often the first thread to tug in unraveling a mystery. She also noticed Clara, the young housemaid from Palm Ellison Manor, hovering near the lemonade stand. Clara's face was pale, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. Miss Marple had spoken to her only yesterday, when Clara had delivered a basket of eggs to her cottage. The girl had seemed anxious, mentioning odd goings-on at the manor lights burning late, voices in hushed tones. Miss Marple had advised her to stay observant but discreet. Now, seeing Clara's unease, she felt a pang of concern. The brass band struck up a new tune, and the crowd shifted as people gathered for the raffle draw. Colonel Bantry took the stage, a makeshift platform of wooden planks, his voice booming as he announced the prizes. Miss Marple watched as Dr. Haydock joined him, the 2 men exchanging a brief glance. It was fleeting, but to Miss Marple it spoke volumes. There was a tension there, a guardedness that suggested more than mere acquaintance. Mr. Ellison, meanwhile, remained at the edge of the crowd, his expression unreadable. Miss Marple's needles paused as she considered the dynamics. Colonel Bantry was a man of honor, but she knew from Dolly that he had faced financial difficulties since retiring. Dr. Haydock was ambitious, always eager to expand the village's modest clinic. And Mr. Ellison? His wealth was undeniable, but his motives were opaque. A pact, she mused, could bind such men for many reasons: greed, power, or fear. Her thoughts were interrupted by a sudden commotion near the tea tent. Mrs. Price, her face flushed, was arguing with a stranger, a man Miss Marple hadn't seen before. He was tall, with a lean frame and a weathered face, his clothes slightly too formal for a village fete. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his eyes darted nervously as Mrs. Price gestured wildly. "You've no business poking about here," she snapped, loud enough for heads to turn. The man raised his hands placatingly, murmuring something Miss Marple couldn't catch. She made a note of his appearance, a gray suit, a nervous tick in his jaw, and a leather satchel slung over his shoulder. He retreated quickly, disappearing into the crowd. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. She glanced at Clara, who had watched the exchange with wide eyes before slipping away toward the manor's stall. Miss Marple decided to follow her movements, slow and deliberate to avoid drawing attention. She paused at the flower stall, pretending to admire a bouquet of roses while keeping Clara in her peripheral vision. The girl was speaking to Mr. Ellison now, her voice low, her hands gesturing urgently. Mr. Ellison's face remained impassive, but he placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, a gesture that seemed more controlling than comforting. Miss Marple's lips tightened. She had seen such gestures before in cases where power dynamics were at play. The raffle concluded with cheers, and Colonel Bantry stepped down from the stage, mopping his brow. Dr. Haydock joined him, and the two men moved toward the edge of the green, where a cluster of oak trees offered shade. Miss Marple adjusted her position, moving closer under the pretense of examining a tray of scones. Their voices were low, but her sharp ears caught fragments of their conversation. "It's under control," Dr. Haydock said, his tone clipped. Colonel Bantry shook his head. "We can't afford mistakes." "Not now." Miss Marple's needles resumed their rhythm, her mind racing. Mistakes, she thought. That word carried weight. It suggested a plan gone awry, a secret teetering on the edge of exposure. As the afternoon wore on, the fate grew livelier. Children played tag, their shrieks echoing across the green. The Women's Institute stall did brisk business, with Mrs. Bantry's fruitcake selling out by 2 o'clock. Miss Marple sipped a cup of tea, her eyes never straying far from the key players. She noticed Mr. Ellison speaking to the stranger from earlier, the man Mrs. Price had confronted. Their exchange was brief, conducted behind the tombola stall, away from prying eyes. But Miss Marple's vantage point gave her a clear view. The stranger handed Mr. Ellison a folded piece of paper, which he tucked into his jacket pocket. The stranger then slipped away, heading toward the village hall. Miss Marple's thoughts churned. The note in the Gazette, the secretive meeting, the strained glances, she was certain they were connected. She recalled a case from years ago when a group of villagers had conspired to hide a theft, their plan unraveling because of a single careless remark. Human nature, she knew, was predictable in its flaws. Greed, fear, or pride often led to mistakes, and Miss Marple was adept at spotting them. She finished her tea and rose, her movements stiff but purposeful. She needed more information, and Clara, she decided, was the key. Approaching the manor's stall, Miss Marple smiled warmly at Clara, who was arranging jars of homemade preserves. "Such a lovely day, isn't it, Clara?" she said, her voice gentle. Clara nodded, but her eyes were wary. "Yes, Miss Marple." "Busy, though." Miss Marple leaned closer, lowering her voice. "You mentioned those late-night meetings at the manor. Have you noticed anything else unusual?" Clara hesitated, glancing toward Mr. Ellison, who was now speaking to Mrs. Clement. "I shouldn't say," she whispered, "but there's a room they lock, upstairs. I heard voices in there last night, not Mr. Ellison's, Miss Marple's." Eyes twinkled with encouragement. "You're a sharp girl, Clara. Keep your ears open, but be careful." Clara nodded, her shoulders relaxing slightly. The fete continued, but the atmosphere grew subtly tense. Miss Marple noticed small things: Mrs. Weatherby's pointed glances at Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry's forced joviality, Mr. Ellison's frequent checks of his pocket watch. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the green, Miss Marple felt a familiar prickle of anticipation. Something was brewing, and she was determined to uncover it. She returned to her chair, her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. The pact, whatever it was fragile. And fragility, she knew, was where secrets came undone. The band played its final tune, and the crowd began to disperse. Miss Marple gathered her things, her eyes lingering on the village hall where the stranger had last been seen. She would speak to Dolly Bantry tomorrow, she decided, and perhaps pay a visit to the vicarage. Mrs. Clement's gossip might hold another clue. As she walked home, her steps slow but steady, the golden light of the setting sun bathed St. Mary. Mead in a deceptive calm, Miss Marple knew better. Shadows had fallen at the fete, and her sharp glance had caught them. The unraveling had begun. The evening air was cool as Miss Marple reached her cottage, the roses in her garden glowing faintly in the dusk. She paused at her gate, her mind replaying the day's observations. The stranger's nervous tick, Clara's whispered fears, the coded words between Haydock and Bantry. It was a puzzle, and she was missing pieces. But puzzles, she reminded herself, were her specialty. She entered her cottage, the familiar creak of the door a comforting sound. As she settled into her armchair, her knitting in her lap, she allowed herself a small smile. The fete had been more than a village celebration. It had been a stage, and the players had revealed more than they knew. Over the next few hours, as the village settled into quiet, Miss Marple's thoughts remained active. She considered the stranger's satchel, the folded paper, the locked room at the manor. Each detail was a thread, and she was determined to weave them together. She recalled a similar case from her youth, when a group of men had conspired to falsify a will, their plan undone by a single overheard conversation. History, she knew, had a way of repeating itself. The pact, whatever its nature, would not remain hidden for long. Not with her watching dot as night fell, Miss Marple lit a small lamp and opened her notebook. She jotted down names: Bantry, Haydock, Ellison, the stranger, Clara, and beside each a few words: motives, secrets, connections. She underlined pact twice. Tomorrow she would dig deeper, perhaps starting with Clara's mention of the locked room. The manor, she suspected, held the key to the mystery. For now, she set her notebook aside and picked up her knitting. The needles clicked softly, a steady rhythm that matched the quiet ticking of her mind. The shadows at the fete had cast their net, but Miss Marple's sharp glance was sharper still, and she would not rest until the secret pact was laid bare. As the morning wore on, Miss Marple decided her next step. She would visit Dolly Bantry, ostensibly for a friendly chat, but with the intention of probing for more information about the council's activities. Dolly was a dear friend, but also a fountain of village gossip, and her husband's involvement made her a key source. Miss Marple would need to tread carefully, however, as Colonel Bantry was sensitive about his reputation. She set her knitting aside and rose to fetch her coat and hat. The air outside was crisp, with a hint of autumn in the breeze. As she stepped onto the garden path, she paused to admire her roses, their petals still vibrant despite the late season. It was a reminder, she thought, that beauty often concealed thorns and secrets. The walk to Gossington Hall, the Bantry's home, was a short one, and Miss Marple took her time, noting the small details of the village. The baker's boy was delivering loaves, whistling as he pedaled his bicycle. Mrs. Price was now gossiping with the vicar's wife, their heads bent close together. And in the distance, near the village hall, she saw Dr. Haydock emerging from his car. His expression preoccupied. Miss Marple's sharp glance missed nothing. She noted the way Dr. Haydock's shoulders were hunched, as if carrying a burden, and the quick glance he cast toward Mr. Ellison's manor. It was a small thing, but to Miss Marple it was another thread in the tapestry of the mystery. At Gossington Hall, Dolly Bantry welcomed her with characteristic warmth, ushering her into the drawing-room where a fire crackled merrily. "Jane, how lovely to see you!" Dolly exclaimed, her round face beaming. "I was just saying to Arthur that we must have you over for tea. The fete was such a success, wasn't it? Though I must say, some people were acting rather oddly." Miss Marple smiled, settling into a plush armchair. "It was a splendid event, Dolly, but I couldn't help noticing a certain tension among the council members. Have you heard anything about their recent activities?" Dolly's eyes sparkled with the promise of gossip. "Oh, Jane, you're as sharp as ever." "Well, I shouldn't say too much, but Arthur's been awfully secretive lately. He's been meeting with Dr. Haydock and that Mr. Ellison something about village land, I think. They're all very hush-hush about it, which isn't like Arthur at all." Miss Marple nodded, encouraging Dolly to continue. "Land, you say? That's interesting. I heard a rumor at the fete about a possible sale. Do you know anything about it?" Dolly leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Well, between you and me, I overheard Arthur talking to Dr. Haydock about a deal to sell part of the old Haverford estate. Apparently, Mr. Ellison wants to develop it, turn it into one of those modern housing estates. But there's something odd about it. Arthur said it could make them all very rich, but only if no one finds out until it's done." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but her expression remained calm. A land deal explained the secrecy, but not the fear Clara had described. Was someone being coerced into the pact, or was there a darker motive at play? "That sounds like quite a plan," she said lightly. "I wonder who else is involved." Dolly shrugged. "I'm not sure, but that Mr. Weaver's been sniffing around, asking questions about the estate's history. Arthur says he's a nuisance, always poking into things that don't concern him." Miss Marple filed this away, her suspicions about Mr. Weaver growing. She spent another hour with Dolly, steering the conversation to lighter topics but gleaning a few more tidbits about the council's recent meetings. By the time she left Gossington Hall, the sun was high and the village was stirring with its usual rhythm. As she walked home, Miss Marple's mind was a whirl of possibilities. The ledger Clara had described was the key, she was certain. If it contained evidence of the pact, it could reveal not only the participants but their motives, but how to access it. She could hardly march into Mr. Ellison's study herself, and asking Clara to take further risks was out of the question. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair once more, her knitting resuming its steady rhythm. She thought of a case from her youth, when a locked diary had held the key to a theft. The solution had come not from breaking into the diary, but from observing the person who held the key. Perhaps Mr. Ellison himself could be persuaded to reveal more if approached with the right questions. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple made a mental note to keep a close eye on Mr. Ellison's manner. She would also need to speak with Mr. Weaver, though she would have to be subtle. A direct confrontation might scare him off, but a chance encounter at the village shop could yield useful information. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour. Miss Marple glanced at it, then out the window, where the lights of Mr. Ellison's manor glowed in the distance. Clara's visit had been the first clue, but it would not be the last. The pact, whatever it was beginning to unravel, and Miss Marple's sharp glance was fixed firmly upon it. She picked up her knitting, her needles clicking in the quiet room. The village of St. Mary Mead might seem peaceful, but Miss Marple knew that beneath its calm exterior, secrets were stirring, and she intended to uncover them, one careful stitch at a time. The evening deepened, and Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the next day. She would need to move quickly before the conspirators grew suspicious. Clara's courage had given her a starting point, and now it was up to her to follow the trail. She thought of a saying her father had been fond of: "The truth is like a needle in a haystack, small, sharp, and waiting to be found." Miss Marple smiled to herself. She was very good at finding needles. As she prepared for bed, she cast one last glance out the window toward the manor. The lights were still on, and she wondered if another secret meeting was taking place even now. Tomorrow she would begin to pull at the threads of the mystery, and she had no doubt that, with patience and her sharp glance, the secret pact would unravel completely. Chapter 4. The First Clue. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's cozy sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a soft shawl draped over her shoulders, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue scarf for her nephew's wife. The village of St. Mary Mead was unusually quiet today, the usual hum of activity subdued after the excitement of the charity fete the previous day. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, however, were far from idle. Her mind was abuzz with the peculiar details she had observed at the fete, details that, to her practiced mind, hinted at something far more sinister than a simple village celebration. The fete had been a grand affair, with colorful stalls lining the village green, children darting about with sticky toffee apples, and the air filled with the cheerful strains of a local brass band. Yet, beneath the surface gaiety, Miss Marple had sensed an undercurrent of tension. It was in the way Dr. Haydock had avoided Colonel Bantry's gaze when they passed each other near the tombola stall, and in the forced smile of Mr. Ellison, the wealthy newcomer to St. Mary Mead, as he handed out prizes for the best jam competition. Most intriguing of all was the snippet of conversation she had overheard between two council members behind the tea tent, a hushed exchange about a fauna pact that must remain secret. Miss Marple's fingers paused mid-stitch as she recalled the words. Ellison's agreed, but we must be careful. No one can know until it's done. She set her knitting aside and reached for her tea, the delicate china cup warm in her hands. The word pact was not one to be taken lightly. In her long experience, such secretive agreements in St. Mary Mead often led to trouble, sometimes of the most serious kind. She thought of old Mrs. Clement's gossip years ago, when a group of villagers had conspired to hide a scandal involving a forged will. That affair had ended in tragedy, and Miss Marple had no intention of letting history repeat itself. Her musings were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, her voice gentle but firm. The door creaked open, and Clara, the young housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor, stepped inside. Clara was a slight girl, no more than 19, with wide brown eyes and a nervous habit of twisting her apron when she spoke. Miss Marple had known her since she was a child, when Clara's mother had worked as a seamstress in the village. The girl's anxious expression now confirmed Miss Marple's suspicion that something was amiss. "Good morning, Clara," Miss Marple said, gesturing to a chair opposite her. "Do sit down. You look as though you've something on your mind." Clara, perched on the edge of the chair, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't know who else to come to," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's about Mr. Ellison's manor. There's been strange things happening, and I'm ever so worried." Miss Marple's eyes softened, but her mind was alert, cataloging every detail of Clara's demeanor, the slight tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted to the window as if expecting someone to be watching. "Strange things," she prompted gently. "Tell me, Clara, what have you seen?" Clara took a deep breath, as if steeling herself. "It's the meetings, ma'am. Late at night, in Mr. Ellison's study. I've heard voices, men's voices, low and secretive, when I'm tidying up after supper. Last night I was polishing the silver in the pantry, and I heard them again. I couldn't catch much, but they were talking about the agreement and how it mustn't get out. They sounded frightened, Miss Marple." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her knitting forgotten. "Frightened, you say? Did you recognize any of the voices?" Clara hesitated, her cheeks flushing. I think one was Dr. Haydock's. I've heard him at the manor before, when he comes to check on Mr. Ellison's gout. And maybe Colonel Bantry, though I'm not sure. There was another voice, too, but I didn't know it. It was sharp, like someone giving orders." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind racing. Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry were both members of the village council, respected figures in St. Mary Mead. Yet their behavior at the fete had struck her as odd, and now Clara's account suggested they were entangled in something clandestine. The mention of a third unfamiliar voice was particularly intriguing. Could it be Mr. Ellison himself, or someone else entirely? And where was Mr. Ellison during these meetings? Miss Marple asked. "He was there, ma'am, I'm sure of it. I saw him go into the study before the others arrived. But he didn't say much, not that I could hear. It's like he was letting someone else take charge." Miss Marple's lips pursed slightly. Mr. Ellison was a man of wealth and influence, having purchased the old Haverford manor on the edge of the village only 6 months ago. He was charming in a polished sort of way, but Miss Marple had always sensed a guardedness about him, as if he were playing a role. She recalled a similar character from her youth, a man who had come to St. Mary Mead with grand promises, only to be revealed as a swindler. Human nature, she thought, never changed. "Clara," Miss Marple said, her tone calm but firm, "this is very important. Have you seen anything else unusual at the manor? Anything out of place, or anyone who shouldn't be there?" Clara's eyes widened, and she nodded vigorously. "Yes, ma'am, now that you mention it. There's a ledger, a big, leather-bound book in Mr. Ellison's study. He keeps it locked in his desk, but I saw it open once when I was dusting. It was full of numbers and names, but not like a regular account book. The writing was strange, like it was in code. I didn't dare look too long, but it gave me the shivers. Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her expression remained serene. A coded ledger was precisely the sort of clue that could unravel a mystery. She thought of a case in her friend Mrs. Bantry's village, where a hidden account book had exposed a smuggling ring. "Did you see any of the names, Clara?" she asked. Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am. I was too scared to read it properly. But I saw initials D, H, and CB, and some numbers that looked like dates or money. I don't know what it means, but it didn't feel right." Miss Marple's mind connected the initials immediately. DH for Dr. Haydock, CB for Colonel Bantry. The ledger could be evidence of the pact she had overheard at the Feda financial scheme, perhaps, or something more nefarious. She leaned back in her chair, her fingers steepled in thought. "You've done well to tell me, Clara," she said, "but you must be careful. Don't speak of this to anyone else, not even your mother. And keep your eyes open at the manor. If you see or hear anything more, come straight to me." Clara nodded, her relief palpable. "Thank you, Miss Marple. I knew you'd know what to do. I don't want to get in trouble, but I couldn't." "Keep quiet." "You've done the right thing," Miss Marple assured her. "Now, would you like a cup of tea before you go?" "It's a chilly morning." Clara declined politely, saying she had to return to the manor before she was missed. As the girl slipped out the door, Miss Marple watched her go, her mind already piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. The ledger was a significant clue, but it was locked away in Ellison's study, and she could hardly ask Clara to steal it. Still, there were other ways to gather information. The village was a small place, and secrets had a way of seeping out, especially when one knew where to look. She rose from her chair and crossed to the window, peering out at the quiet street. The postman was making his rounds, and Mrs. Price was sweeping her front step, pausing to chat with a neighbor. To an outsider, St. Mary Mead was the picture of tranquility, but Miss Marple knew better. Beneath the surface, currents of ambition, greed, and fear often swirled, and it was her gift to sense them. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sight of a figure striding down the lane, a tall, lean man in a tweed coat, carrying a leather satchel. It was Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian who had arrived in the village 2 days ago, claiming to research local land records. Miss Marple had met him briefly at the fete, and his evasive answers had struck her as odd. Now, as he passed her cottage, she noticed the way his eyes darted nervously, as if he feared being followed. He glanced toward Mr. Ellison's manor, then quickened his pace. Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. Mr. Weaver was another piece of the puzzle, and she suspected he was no more a historian than she was a trapeze artist. She recalled a similar character from a case years ago, a man posing as a scholar to gain access to a wealthy estate, only to be revealed as a private investigator. Could Mr. Weaver be involved in the pact, or was he like her, seeking to uncover it? She returned to her armchair and picked up her knitting, her mind working as swiftly as her needles. The pact, the ledger, the late-night meetings, and now Mr. Weaver's suspicious behavior all pointed to a conspiracy centered on Mr. Ellison's manor. But what was the nature of the pact? A financial scheme, perhaps, involving the sale of village land, as Mrs. Bantry had hinted at the fete. Or something more sinister, like blackmail or fraud? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the council members. Dr. Haydock was a practical man, respected for his medical expertise, but known to be ambitious. Colonel Bantry, on the other hand, was a proud man, struggling to maintain his status after financial setbacks. Mr. Ellison, with his wealth and influence, could easily have drawn them into a scheme. But why? And who was the third voice Clara had heard, the one giving orders? Chapter 5. The unexpected visitor. The morning sun cast a gentle glow over St. Mary Mead, its rays filtering through the lace curtains of Miss Jane Marple's sitting room. She sat in her favorite armchair, a delicate teacup balanced on its saucer. In her hand, her knitting needles resting quietly on the table beside her. The village was stirring into its usual rhythm, Mrs. Price's voice calling out to her terrier, the faint clatter of milk bottles being delivered, the soft hum of a bicycle as young Tommy cycled past on his paper route. To an outsider, it was the picture of pastoral serenity, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes missed nothing. She had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to know that beneath its tranquil surface, secrets often simmered. The charity fete was 2 days away, and the village was abuzz with preparations. Bunting was being strung across the high street, and the Women's Institute, led by the formidable Mrs. Dane Calthrop, was organizing stalls with military precision. Miss Marple had promised to contribute a jar of her homemade damson jam to the preserves table, but her mind was elsewhere. The anonymous note in the village gazette, hinting at a pact among prominent villagers, lingered in her thoughts. It was vague, almost playful in its tone, but Miss Marple had learned never to dismiss such things. She recalled a similar incident years ago in the village cryptic message in the church bulletin that had unraveled a scandal involving a forged will. Human nature, she mused, was predictable in its unpredictability. As she sipped her tea, her gaze drifted to the window, where she noticed a stranger walking up the lane toward the village square. He was a tall man, perhaps in his late 40s, with a lean frame and a brisk, purposeful stride. His attire was peculiar for St. Mary. Mead, a well-tailored gray suit, a trilby hat tilted just so, and a leather satchel slung over one shoulder. He carried himself with the air of someone who belonged in a bustling city, not a sleepy village. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Strangers were not uncommon, especially with the fete approaching, but this man's demeanor suggested he was no casual visitor. She set her teacup down and reached for her knitting, her fingers moving automatically as her mind worked. The stranger paused at the corner of the lane, glancing at a small notebook he pulled from his pocket. He seemed to be checking an address, his brow furrowing as he scanned the cottages. Miss Marple's curiosity deepened. She knew every resident of St. Mary Mead, from the vicar's wife to the butcher's apprentice, and this man was not one of them. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at her door. "Miss Marple?" came the voice of her maid, Cherry Baker, a cheerful young woman with a penchant for gossip. "There's a gentleman asking to see you. Says his name's Mr. Weaver. He's got a queer way about him, if you ask me." Miss Marple smiled faintly. Cherry's assessments were often as useful as they were colorful. "Show him in, Cherry," she said, smoothing her skirt and adjusting her shawl. She was accustomed to unexpected visitors villagers often sought. Her advice on matters both trivial and grave, but a stranger was a rarity. Mr. Weaver entered the sitting room with a polite nod, removing his hat to reveal neatly combed dark hair streaked with gray. His eyes were sharp, darting around the room as if cataloging every detail: the chintz curtains, the porcelain figurines on the mantel, the half-finished scarf on Miss Marple's knitting needles. He carried an air of quiet intensity, like a man who was always one step ahead of a conversation. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth but with a faint edge of nervousness. "I hope I'm not intruding. My name is Leonard Weaver, and I'm a historian researching the history of local estates in this part of England. I was told you're something of an authority on St. Mary Mead." Miss Marple's expression remained placid, but her mind was alert. A historian, she thought, yet his hands are too soft for a scholar who spent his days in dusty archives. "And that satchel expensive, but well worn, as if it's seen more than library shelves." She gestured to a chair opposite her. "Please, Mr. Weaver, do sit down. I'm hardly an authority, but I've lived here all my life. What brings you to our little village?" Mr. Weaver settled into the chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. "I'm particularly interested in the Ellison estate," he said, his tone measured. "It's one of the older properties in the area, and I've heard it has a fascinating history. Land records, family lineages, that sort of thing. I thought you might know something of its past." Miss Marple's eyes flickered with interest. The Ellison estate, owned by the wealthy and somewhat reclusive Mr. Charles Ellison, who had moved to St. Mary Mead only 2 years ago, was at the heart of the whispers she'd been hearing. Clara, the young housemaid, had mentioned late night meetings at the manor, and the anonymous note had hinted at a pact involving prominent villagers. Mr. Weaver's sudden interest in the estate was no coincidence. She was certain. "The Ellison estate is quite grand," she said, her voice mild. "Mr. Ellison has done much to restore it, though he keeps to himself. The house was built in the early 18th century, I believe, by a merchant family. But I'm sure you know that already, being a historian." She paused, her eyes meeting his. "What exactly are you hoping to find?" Mr. Weaver hesitated, his fingers tightening on the strap of his satchel. "Oh, just the usual," he said with a forced smile. "Details about ownership, any notable events tied to the property. I've been digging through county records, but they're incomplete. I thought a local perspective might fill in the gaps." Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene but her mind racing. His story was plausible, yet something about his demeanor, the way his eyes darted to the window, the slight tremor in his hand, suggested he was not entirely truthful. She recalled a young man from her nephew Raymond's literary circle, a so-called journalist who had turned out to be a private investigator. Mr. Weaver, she suspected, was no historian. "St. Mary Mead is full of stories," she said, picking up her knitting and letting the needles click softly. "But old houses like the Ellison estate often hold their secrets tightly. Have you spoken to Mr. Ellison himself? He might have records you'd find useful." Mr. Weaver's smile faltered. "I haven't had the chance yet," he said. "He's a busy man, I understand. I was hoping to gather some background before approaching him." "Very wise," Miss Marple said, her tone encouraging but her eyes keen. "Mr. Ellison is particular about his privacy, though I'm sure you've noticed the village is quite open about its gossip." "Have you heard anything interesting since you arrived?" The question was gentle, almost casual, but Miss Marple watched him closely. Mr. Weaver shifted in his seat, his fingers brushing the edge of his notebook. "Not much," he said, a touch too quickly. "Just talk about the fate and the usual. Village matters, nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple smiled, her needles moving steadily. "Nothing out of the ordinary," she thought, "yet you're here, asking about an estate tied to whispers of a secret pact." She decided to press a little. "Further, I suppose you've heard about the village council," she said. "They've been quite active lately, planning the fate and discussing some land matters. Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry are both involved. Fine men, though they have their quirks, as we all do." Mr. Weaver's eyes flickered with something recognition. Perhaps, or unease. "I've heard their names," he said cautiously. "They're on the council, yes?" "I imagine they'd know a great deal about local properties." "Oh, indeed," Miss Marple said, her voice light. "Colonel Bantry is a dear friend, though he's been rather preoccupied lately. And Dr. Haydock, well, he's the sort who notices everything, much like myself." She let the words hang in the air, watching as Mr. Weaver's jaw tightened. Ever so slightly, the conversation was interrupted by Cherry, who bustled in with a tray of tea and biscuits. "Thought you might like a bit of refreshment," she said cheerfully, setting the tray on the table. "Mr. Weaver, you're staying at the Blue Boar, aren't you? Mrs. Lumley was saying you've been asking all sorts of questions about the village." Miss Marple noted the flush that crept up Mr. Weaver's neck. "Just doing my research," he said, accepting a cup of tea. "Villages like this have so much history tucked away." "Quite so," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "And so many secrets, too. But I'm sure you'll find what you're looking for, Mr. Weaver. St. Mary Mead has a way of revealing things in time." They chatted for a few more minutes, Mr. Weaver steering the conversation toward innocuous topics, the architecture of the village church, the history of the local pub, but Miss Marple sensed his discomfort. When he finally rose to leave, thanking her for her time, she noticed he clutched his satchel a little too tightly. As Cherry showed him out, Miss Marple leaned back in her chair, her knitting forgotten. Mr. Weaver was no historian. She was certain of that now. His questions about the Ellison estate, his nervous glances, his vague answers, they all pointed to a man with a purpose he wasn't sharing. She rose and moved to the window, watching as Mr. Weaver walked down the lane toward the village square. He paused at the corner, glancing back at her cottage as if to ensure he wasn't being followed. Then he turned and headed toward the Ellison estate, his stride quickening. Miss Marple's lips curved into a small smile. "Well, well," she murmured, "what are you really after, Mr. Weaver?" The rest of the morning passed quietly, but Miss Marple's mind was far from idle. She thought of Clara's stories about the late-night meetings at the Ellison Manor, the anonymous note in the Gazette, and now this mysterious stranger who claimed to be a historian. She recalled a case from her youth when a so-called surveyor had come to St. Mary Mead asking questions about a disputed boundary. It had turned out he was working for a developer trying to buy up land on the cheap. Mr. Weaver's arrival felt eerily similar by afternoon. Miss Marple decided to take a stroll to the village square, ostensibly to check on the fete preparations, but really to gather more information. She put on her best hat, a sensible straw affair with a small ribbon, and picked up her walking. Stick. The square was a hive of activity, with villagers hammering stakes for stalls, arranging tables, and arguing good-naturedly about the placement of the tombola. Miss Marple greeted Mrs. Dane Calthrop, who was supervising with her usual blend of enthusiasm and chaos. "Jane, you've come just in time," Mrs. Dane Calthrop called, waving her over. "We're short a judge for the cake competition." "You're not too busy, are you?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "I see Mr. Ellison is here." "He's been so generous with the fete, hasn't he?" Mrs. Dane Calthrop nodded, her expression tightening. "Oh, yes, he's donated a tidy sum. Though between you and me, Jane, I think he's trying to buy goodwill. There's talk about that land of his. Some say he wants to sell it for a fancy development. The council's been awfully secretive about it." Miss Marple's interest sharpened. "Secretive, you say? Well, councils do love their little meetings. I suppose Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry are involved?" "Of course," Mrs. Dane Calthrop said, lowering her voice. "And between you and me, I think they're up to something. There's been too many closed-door meetings at the village hall. And that new man, Mr. Weaver, was it? He's been sniffing around, asking about the Ellison estate." "Makes you wonder," Miss Marple nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It does, indeed," she said. "Perhaps I'll have a word with Mr. Ellison myself. He's over there, isn't he?" She spotted Charles Ellison near the refreshment stall, a tall, imposing man with silver hair and a stern face. He was speaking to Colonel Bantry, their heads bent close together, their expressions serious. Miss Marple made her way over, her steps slow but deliberate. As she approached, the two men glanced up, and she caught a flicker of unease in Colonel Bantry's eyes. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," she said, her voice bright. "What a lovely day for the fete preparations. Mr. Ellison, I hear you've been most generous." Ellison gave a tight smile. "Just doing my part, Miss Marple. St. Mary Mead has been kind to me." "Kind, yes," she said, tilting her head. "Though I hear you've had a visitor, Mr. Weaver, the historian. He was asking about your estate. I do hope he wasn't a bother." Ellison's smile faded, and Colonel Bantry coughed awkwardly. "Weaver?" Ellison said, his tone clipped. "Yes, he came by. Nosy fellow, but harmless. Just poking around. For some book he's writing." "Harmless," Miss Marple repeated, her eyes twinkling. "Well, that's a relief. Though one does hear such stories about historians digging up more than old records. I remember a case in Chipping Cleghorn quite. A scandal, really." She let the comment hang, watching as Ellison's jaw tightened and Colonel Bantry shifted uncomfortably. Before either could respond, Dr. Haydock joined them, his usual jovial demeanor tempered by a hint of strain. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope you're not stirring up trouble with your stories." "Me? Never," she said, her smile innocent. "I was just chatting with Mr. Weaver this morning. Such an interesting man. So curious about the village and your estate, Mr. Ellison." The three men exchanged glances, and Miss Marple noted the silent communication. Something was afoot, she was certain. The pact, the meetings, Mr. Weaver's arrival, it all pointed to a secret they were desperate to keep hidden. But what? And why? As the afternoon wore on, Miss Marple continued her rounds, chatting with villagers and gleaning snippets of gossip. Mrs. Price mentioned seeing Mr. Weaver near the Ellison estate late at night, his satchel clutched tightly. Young Tommy, the paper boy, said he'd overheard Dr. Haydock arguing with someone in the village hall about the deal. And Clara, who was helping set up the jam stall, whispered that she'd seen a strange car parked near the manor the previous evening. By the time Miss Marple returned home, her mind was a whirl of connections. She sat by her fire, her knitting in her lap, and thought of Mr. Weaver. His nervousness, his vague answers, his focus on the Ellison estate, it all suggested he was more than he seemed. A private investigator, perhaps, or someone with a personal stake in the manor's secrets. And the council members, Colonel Bantry's financial troubles were no secret, and Dr. Haydock had always been ambitious. As for Ellison, his wealth and reclusiveness made him a perfect target for speculation. She recalled a conversation with her nephew Raymond, who had once described a case of corporate espionage disguised as historical research. The parallels were striking. Mr. Weaver, she decided, was likely working for someone, perhaps a rival landowner, or even a government agency looking to uncover something about the Ellison estate. The pact, whatever it was, likely involved money, land, or both. And if Clara's stories were true, the late-night meetings suggested it. It's something they couldn't risk being exposed. As evening fell, Miss Marple lit a lamp and opened her notebook, jotting down her observations. She wrote, "Mr. Weaver nervous, not a historian. Asking about Ellison estate. Council members uneasy. Pact likely involves land deal. Clara's meeting's key." She paused, her pen hovering over the page. There was still much to uncover, but she felt the familiar thrill of a puzzle coming together. Human nature, she thought, was like her knitting pull one thread, and the whole pattern could unravel. The next day, Miss Marple resolved to keep a closer eye on Mr. Weaver. She enlisted Cherry's help, asking her to report any sightings of the man around the village. Cherry, delighted by the prospect of a mystery, agreed eagerly. "He's a shifty one, that Mr. Weaver," she said. "I'll bet he's up to no good." "Don't jump to conclusions, Cherry," Miss Marple said, though she couldn't suppress a smile. "But do keep your eyes open." By midday, Cherry returned with news. Mr. Weaver had been seen at the village hall, speaking to the clerk about old land records. He'd also been spotted near the Ellison estate again, this time with a camera. Miss Marple's suspicions deepened. A camera suggested he was gathering evidence, perhaps photographs of the manor or its grounds. But for whom? And why? She decided to pay a visit to Dolly Bantry, her old friend and the wife of Colonel Bantry. Dolly was a font of village gossip and had a knack for knowing more than she let on. Miss Marple found her in her garden, pruning roses with a vigor that suggested she was working off some frustration. "Jane, thank goodness you're here," Dolly said, wiping her brow. "This fate is driving me mad, and Arthur's been no help at all. He's been so distracted lately, always off to these council meetings. I swear, something's going on." Miss Marple settled onto a garden bench, her eyes sympathetic but alert. "Men do get caught up in their projects," she said. "I hear there's been talk of a land deal. Something about the Ellison estate, perhaps." Dolly's eyes widened. "You've heard that too?" "I told Arthur it's foolish to get mixed up in such things, but he says it's all above board. Something about selling a parcel of land for a new development. But it's all so hush-hush, Jane, and that Mr. Weaver, he's been asking questions about it. Arthur says he's just a nuisance, but I think there's more to it." Miss Marple nodded, her mind piecing together the fragments. A land deal, secret meetings, a nervous stranger. It was all beginning to form a picture. But there were still missing pieces. Why was Ellison involved? What was the pact, exactly? And what did Mr. Weaver stand to gain? As she walked home, Miss Marple passed the Ellison estate, its high walls and iron gates imposing in the late afternoon. Light. She paused, her eyes catching a glint of movement in the shrubbery. It was Mr. Weaver, crouching near the gate, his camera in hand. He didn't see her, too focused on his task. Miss Marple stepped back behind a tree, her heart quickening. Whatever he was photographing, it was clearly important. She waited until he slipped away, then made her way home, her mind buzzing. That evening, she sat by her fire, her knitting untouched as she thought through the day's events. Mr. Weaver's presence was no accident, and his interest in the Ellison estate was tied to the pact. She recalled a case from her youth when a man posing as a surveyor had been caught spying for a rival landowner. The parallels were uncanny. Mr. Weaver, she decided, was likely working for someone with an interest in the land deal, someone who stood to lose if it went through. The next morning, Miss Marple received another visitor, Clara, the housemaid. Her face pale and her hands trembling. "Miss Marple," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder, "I saw something last night at the manor." There was a man, not Mr. Weaver, someone else slipping out the back gate. He had a bundle, like papers or something. And Mr. Ellison was in the study, burning documents in the fireplace. I think they're hiding something. Miss Marple patted Clara's hand, her voice soothing but her mind alert. "You've done well to tell me, Clara," she said. "Don't worry. I'll look into it. But you must be careful. Don't let anyone know you've seen this." Chapter 6. A Death in the Village. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of St. Mary Mead, wrapping the village in a soft gray shroud that seemed to muffle even the usual chatter of sparrows. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window, her knitting, needles clicking rhythmically as she gazed out at the familiar scene. The roses in her garden, heavy with dew, bowed slightly under the weight of the damp air. It was a quiet, unremarkable morning, or so it seemed until the sharp peal of the church bell broke the stillness, not in its usual measured toll, but in a frantic, uneven clamor that sent a shiver down Miss Marple's spine. She set her knitting aside, her fingers pausing mid-stitch, and leaned closer to the window. Across the lane, she saw Mrs. Price, her neighbor, hurrying out of her cottage, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, despite the mildness of the day. Mrs. Price's face was pale, her eyes wide with something that looked like fear. Miss Marple's sharp glance took in the details, the way Mrs. Price's hands trembled as she clutched her shawl, the hurried glances she cast toward the center of the village. Something was wrong. Rising from her chair, Miss Marple smoothed her skirt and reached for her hat. She had learned long ago that the smallest disturbances in St. Mary Mead could unravel into something far more significant. As she stepped outside, the air felt heavy with an unspoken tension, and she quickened her pace toward the village square, where a small crowd was already gathering near the imposing gates of Mr. Ellison's manor. The manor, a grand Georgian structure that had stood at the edge of St. Mary Mead for generations, had been Mr. Ellison's home since his arrival 3 years prior. A wealthy widower with a penchant for privacy, he had stirred curiosity among the villagers, though few, had penetrated his reserved demeanor. Miss Marple had observed him at the charity fete only days ago, noting the way his eyes darted nervously when speaking with Colonel Bantry and Dr. Haydock. Now, as she approached the manor's gates, she saw Constable Reed, the young policeman, standing guard, his face grim. "What's happened, Constable?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm but carrying the quiet authority that made people answer without hesitation. Reed hesitated, then lowered his voice. "It's Mr. Ellison, Miss Marple. Found dead in his study this morning. The maid, Clara, discovered him. Looks like—" "Well, it doesn't look natural, ma'am." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained serene. "Not natural, you say? Has Inspector Craddock been called?" "Yes, ma'am." "He's on his way from Much Benham. Dr. Haydock's inside now, examining the body." Miss Marple nodded, her mind already turning over the possibilities. Poison, perhaps, or a blow disguised as an accident. She recalled the cryptic conversation she'd overheard at the fete, the mention of a pact that had set her instincts on edge. Mr. Ellison's death, so soon after those whispered words, was no coincidence. She thanked Constable Reed and moved closer to the crowd, her ears attuned to the murmurs rippling through the villagers. "He was fine yesterday," Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was saying to a group of women. "I saw him at the fete, bidding on that dreadful vase for the church fund. Who could have done such a thing?" "Probably that stranger, Mr. Weaver," muttered Mr. Pye, the local baker, his flour-dusted apron flapping as he gestured. "Shifty fellow, always asking questions about the manor. I don't trust him." Miss Marple listened without comment, her mind cataloguing each remark. Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian who had arrived only days ago, had indeed caught her attention. His nervous demeanor and overly specific questions about the manors. Land records suggested he was more than he claimed. But to leap to murder was premature. She needed facts, and facts, she knew, were often hidden in the smallest details. As the crowd parted, Miss Marple caught sight of Clara, the young housemaid, standing near the manor's entrance. Clara's face was ashen, her hands twisting a handkerchief into knots. Miss Marple approached her gently, her smile warm but her eyes sharp. "Clara, my dear," she said softly, "this must be a terrible shock. Would you like to sit with me?" "A moment?" Clara nodded, her eyes brimming with tears. They moved to a bench near the manor's garden, where the scent of lavender mingled with the damp air. Miss Marple waited, knowing that silence often prompted confidences more effectively than questions. "It was awful, Miss Marple," Clara whispered at last. "I went in to bring Mr. Ellison his tea, like always, and there he was, slumped over. His desk, his face. It was so still, like he was sleeping, but his eyes were open, staring at nothing. I screamed and ran for Dr. Haydock." Miss Marple patted Clara's hand. "You did exactly right, Clara. Did you notice anything unusual in the study? Anything out of place?" Clara hesitated, her brow furrowing. "Well, there was a glass on the desk, half full of something. Whiskey, maybe? Mr. Ellison didn't. Usually drink in the morning. And his papers were all scattered, not neat like he kept them." Miss Marple's mind seized on the glass. Poison was a likely candidate, especially if administered in a drink. And was anyone else in the house? "Last night or this morning?" she asked. Clara shook her head. "Not that I saw," The other staff had the evening off, and I locked up after dinner. But she lowered her voice, glancing around. I heard footsteps late last night near the study. I thought it was Mr. Ellison working late, but now I'm not so sure. Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her thoughts racing. Footsteps in the night, a glass of whiskey, scattered papers. These were threads she could weave into a pattern, but she needed more. "Thank you, Clara," she said. "You've been very brave. If you remember anything else, come to me, won't you?" As Clara nodded and hurried back to the manor, Miss Marple saw Inspector Craddock's car pull up. The inspector, a tall man with a brisk manner and a keen mind, was one of the few policemen Miss Marple respected. He tipped his hat to her as he approached. "Miss Marple," he said, a hint of a smile in his eyes. "I might have known you'd be here. Care to share any observations?" "Not yet, Inspector," she replied demurely, "but I trust you'll find the truth. A glass on the desk, perhaps, and some scattered papers." Craddock's smile faded, replaced by a look of respect. "You don't miss much, do you? We'll check the glass for poison. Dr. Haydock suspects it might be cyanide, but we'll need the lab to confirm." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Cyanide is quick, isn't it, and leaves little time for struggle. Curious for a man like Mr. Ellison." Craddock raised an eyebrow but said nothing, turning to enter the manor. Miss Marple lingered outside, her eyes scanning the garden. A bed of foxgloves caught her attention, beautiful, but deadly if misused. She made a mental note to ask Dr. Haydock about local plants later. For now, she returned to the crowd, listening as the villagers' shock gave way to speculation. By midday, the manor was cordoned off, and the villagers dispersed, their whispers carrying the weight of suspicion. Miss Marple walked home slowly, her mind turning over the morning's events. Mr. Ellison's death was no random act. It was tied to the pact she'd overheard at the fete, a secret that had evidently turned deadly. The question was who stood to gain and who feared exposure enough to kill. Back in her cottage, Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the click of her needles a steady counterpoint to her thoughts. She recalled a case from years ago in St. Mary Mead, when a seemingly innocent agreement among neighbors had masked greed and betrayal. The parallels were striking. A group of respected villagers, a hidden deal, a sudden death. But this time, the stakes felt higher, the threads more tangled. That she thought of Colonel Bantry, whose financial troubles were no secret, and Dr. Haydock, whose ambition sometimes outstripped his ethics. Then there was Mr. Weaver, the outsider with too many questions, and Clara's mention of footsteps in the night. Each was a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. As the afternoon sun dipped low, casting long shadows across her garden, Miss Marple set her knitting aside and reached for her notebook. She jotted down the facts: the glass, the papers, the footsteps, the foxgloves. Then she added a question: who was in the manor last night, and what did they want? The answer, she knew, lay in the details, the small, overlooked things that her sharp glance always caught. She would need to speak to Clara again, and perhaps pay a visit to Dr. Haydock. The village was holding its breath, and Miss Marple intended to find out why. The next day dawned brighter, the mist burned away by a warm July sun. Miss Marple decided to visit the manor under the pretense of offering condolences to the staff. Clara greeted her at the door. her eyes red from crying but her manner composed. "Miss Marple, it's kind of you to come," Clara said, leading her to the servants' parlor. "The police have been here all morning, asking questions." They took the glass and some of Mr. Ellison's papers. Miss Marple nodded, settling into a chair. "I'm sure it's all very upsetting. Tell me, Clara, did Mr. Ellison have any visitors recently? Anyone who seemed out of place?" Clara hesitated, then leaned closer. "There was one man, a week ago. He came late, after dark. I didn't see his face, but Mr. Ellison was cross. After he left, said something about keeping promises and no one backing out now." Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she kept her tone gentle. "Did you hear a name, perhaps?" Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am. But I think it was someone from the village council. Mr. Ellison was always meeting with them, Colonel Bantry, Dr. Haydock, sometimes Mrs. Clement." Miss Marple filed this away. The council members again. The pact was becoming clearer, a web of promises and secrets that had ensnared Mr. Ellison and perhaps led to his death. She thanked Clara and left, her mind buzzing with possibilities. That evening, Miss Marple attended a village meeting at the hall where the council was addressing the tragedy. Colonel Bantry, his face flushed, spoke of Mr. Ellison's contributions to St. Mary Mead, while Dr. Haydock offered a somber account of the medical finding cyanide as suspected. Though the source was still unknown, Mr. Weaver sat at the back, his notebook open, scribbling furiously. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the way his eyes flicked toward the council members. After the meeting, she approached Dr. Haydock, her smile disarming. "A dreadful business, doctor," she said. "I couldn't help noticing the foxgloves in Mr. Ellison's garden. Such lovely flowers, but dangerous, aren't they?" Dr. Haydock's expression tightened for a fraction of a second before he nodded. "Quite right, Miss Marple. But cyanide isn't derived from foxgloves. That's digitalis, a different poison altogether." "Of course," Miss Marple said, her tone apologetic but her eyes sharp. "My mistake. Though I suppose any garden could hide secrets, couldn't it?" Dr. Haydock laughed, a little too heartily, and excused himself. Miss Marple watched him go, her suspicions deepening. The doctor's knowledge of poisons was extensive, and his reaction suggested he knew more than he was saying. As the days passed, St. Mary Mead remained on edge. The police investigation continued, but Inspector Craddock confided in Miss Marple that they were struggling to find a motive. "Everyone liked Ellison," he said, frustration creeping into his voice. "He was private, but generous. No enemies we can find." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, "the enemy wasn't personal, but practical. A secret shared can be a dangerous thing, Inspector." Craddock gave her a long look. "You're thinking of that pact rumor, aren't you? Any ideas who might be involved?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Only guesses, for now. But secrets have a way of coming to light, don't they?" She returned to her cottage, her mind piecing together the fragments. The pact, the footsteps, the glass, the scattered papers, the foxgloves that weren't foxgloves. And then there was Clara's mention of the late-night visitor, the angry words about promises. Miss Marple closed her eyes, letting the pieces settle like a pattern in her knitting. She thought of a story from her youth, when a group of villagers had conspired to hide a theft, only to unravel when one turned on the others. Greed, fear, betrayal, these were the threads that wove through every mystery. Mr. Ellison's death was no different. Someone had broken the pact or feared its exposure. And that someone, she was certain, was still in St. Mary Mead. The next morning, Miss Marple visited Dolly Bantry, her old friend, whose husband, Colonel Bantry, was a key figure in the council. Over tea, Dolly shared her own suspicions. "Arthur's been so distracted lately," she said, stirring her cup. "He's worried about money, you know. The estate's been a burden, and I heard him talking to Mr. Ellison about some land deal. Nothing improper, I'm sure, but—" Miss Marple listened, her face attentive but her mind racing. A land deal. That fit with the rumors of a pact to sell village land for profit. If Mr. Ellison had threatened to expose it or refused to continue, it could explain his murder. But who had the most to lose? She spent the afternoon walking the village, her eyes taking in every detail: the manor's garden, the council members' homes, the quiet lanes where secrets could hide. At the church, she paused to speak with Mrs. Clement, who mentioned a heated argument between Mr. Ellison and Dr. Haydock at the last council meeting. Something about funds for the new clinic, Mrs. Clement said. Dr. Haydock was quite upset. Miss Marple thanked her and moved on, her thoughts circling back to the doctor. His ambition to build a new clinic was well known, and such a project required money that a land deal could provide. But if Mr. Ellison had opposed it, or threatened to reveal the pact— By evening, Miss Marple was back at her cottage, her notebook filled with observations. She drew a line connecting Dr. Haydock to the manor, the poison, and the pact. But she needed more a final piece to tie it all together. She decided to speak to Mr. Weaver again, suspecting his historical research was a cover for something. The next day, she found him at the village inn, poring over a map of the manor's estate. "Miss Marple," he said, startled, as she approached, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I like to keep an eye on things," she said, her smile gentle but her gaze piercing. "Tell me, Mr. Weaver, what exactly are you looking for?" "In those land records—" He hesitated, then sighed. "I suppose there's no harm in telling you. I'm not a historian. I was hired by a rival estate owner to investigate Mr. Ellison's plans. There's talk of a deal to sell part of the manor's land for development. Big money, but it's all hush-hush. I think Ellison was going to back out, and someone didn't like that." Miss Marple's heart quickened. "And do you know who was involved in this deal?" Weaver glanced around, lowering his voice. "Colonel Bantry, Dr. Haydock, maybe others on the council, but I don't have proof. And now with Ellison dead, I'm worried I'm next." Miss Marple nodded, her mind slotting the final pieces into place. The pact was real, and Mr. Ellison's death was its consequence. But the killer, she was almost certain now, was someone who feared exposure more than the others. Someone with access to poison, knowledge of its use, and a motive tied to ambition. As she left the inn, the church bell tolled again, a single mournful note. Miss Marple paused, her sharp glance taking in the village around her. St. Mary Mead was a place of secrets. But secrets, she knew, could not hide forever. She would unravel this pact, and the truth would come to light. The days that followed were a blur of quiet inquiries and careful observation. Miss Marple spoke to Clara again, who recalled seeing Dr. Haydock near the manor the night before Mr. Ellison's death. She visited the manor's garden, noting the absence of foxgloves, but the presence of other plants that could conceal a poison. She even called on Inspector Craddock, sharing just enough to steer his investigation without revealing her full suspicions. By the end of the week, the village was abuzz with new rumors. The police had found traces of cyanide in the whiskey glass, and a search of Mr. Ellison's study revealed a half-finished letter warning of betrayal and greed. Miss Marple read the letter at Craddock's request, her eyes lingering on the word pact. "It's clear now, isn't it?" Craddock said. Someone wanted to keep this quiet, but who? Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Give it time, Inspector. The truth has a way of showing itself, and so it did." As Miss Marple sat in her garden, knitting and thinking, the pieces fell into place. Dr. Haydock, with his ambition and his knowledge of poisons. Colonel Bantry, with his debts and his desperation. Mr. Weaver, with his secrets, but no clear motive for murder. And Clara, the innocent observer who had seen just enough to point the way. The village of St. Mary Mead would heal. Miss Marple knew, but not before the guilty were brought to light. She closed her notebook, her sharp glance resting on the roses. Outside her window, the truth was close now, and she would see it through. Chapter 7. Whispers of a Pact. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a ball of soft blue wool in her lap, her knitting, needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a scarf for her nephew Raymond. To an outsider, she appeared the picture of serene domesticity, an elderly spinster lost in her thoughts and her craft. But those who knew Miss Jane Marple understood that her mind was never idle, especially not now, when the air of St. Mary Mead seemed thick with secrets. The charity fate had come and gone, leaving behind a trail of whispers and unease. Miss Marple had observed the villagers closely that day, her sharp eyes catching the fleeting glances, the forced smiles, and the hurried whispers exchanged between Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and the enigmatic Mr. Ellison. Their behavior had confirmed her suspicion that something was afoot. Something tied to the cryptic note in the village gazette about a pact. The word lingered in her mind, heavy with implications. A pact suggested collusion, Astaff, and the death of Mr. Ellison 2 days prior had only deepened the mystery. Poisoned, Inspector Craddock had said, though the motive remained elusive. Miss Marple, however, was beginning to see connections, like threads in a tapestry, waiting to be woven together. She set her knitting aside and sipped her tea, her thoughts drifting to her conversation with Dolly Bantry the previous evening. Dolly, ever the enthusiastic gossip, had come for tea and stayed for nearly 2 hours, her words tumbling out in a rush of excitement and speculation. "Jane, you wouldn't believe the talk going around," she had said, leaning forward in her chair, her eyes bright with the thrill of scandal. "They're saying there's some sort of deal, something underhanded, mark my words, about selling off that patch of land near Ellison's Manor. The council's involved, or so I've heard. Haydock, Bantry, and Ellison himself, before he, well, you know." She had lowered her voice, as if the walls of Miss Marple's cottage might carry the tale back to the village. "They're calling it a pact, Jane, a secret pact." Miss Marple had listened patiently, her expression one of polite interest, though her mind was racing. Dolly's rumors were not to be taken at face value. She had a tendency to embellish, but there was often a kernel of truth in village gossip. A pact to sell land, likely for profit, fit neatly with the secretive meetings Clara had mentioned and the strained interactions at the fete. It also provided a potential motive for Mr. Ellison's murder. If he had been part of this pact but threatened to expose it, or perhaps demanded a larger share, someone might have seen fit to remove him permanently. Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Dr. Haydock with his practiced charm and ambitious streak, and to Colonel Bantry, whose financial troubles were no secret to those who paid attention. Either could have reason to silence Ellison, but she needed more than supposition. She needed evidence. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed softly, pulling her from her reverie. It was nearly time for her daily walk, a ritual she used not only for exercise but for observation. St. Mary Mead was a small village, and its residents were creatures of habit. A stroll through the high street or past the village hall often revealed more than hours of questioning ever could. She donned her coat and hat, picked up her walking stick more for appearance than necessity, and set out into the crisp autumn air. The village was quiet this morning, the post-fete lethargy settling over St. Mary Mead like a fog. The high street was nearly deserted, save for old Mr. Clement sweeping leaves from his shop's doorstep and Mrs. Price haggling with the butcher over a cut of lamb. Miss Marple nodded politely as she passed, her eyes scanning for anything out of the ordinary. She took the long route toward the village hall, where Clara had mentioned seeing late-night gatherings. The hall itself was unremarkable, a squat stone building with ivy creeping up its walls, but Miss Marple paused across the street, pretending to adjust her scarf while she studied the windows and doors. Nothing seemed amiss, no broken locks, no signs of clandestine activity, but then she hadn't expected the culprits to be so careless. As she turned toward the lane leading to Ellison's manor, she spotted young Tommy Pierce, the baker's boy, pedaling furiously on his bicycle, a parcel tucked under his arm. He slowed as he saw her, tipping his cap with a grin. "Morning, Miss Marple. Off to solve another mystery." She smiled, accustomed to the village's gentle teasing about her hobby. "Just taking the air, Tommy," she replied. "Delivering something to the manor?" "Aye, some papers for Mr. Weaver," he said, then lowered his voice conspiratorially. "He's been asking all sorts of questions about Mr. Ellison's land, you know. Proper nosy, that one." Miss Marple's interest sharpened, though she kept her tone light. "Is he now? Well, historians do love their details. Good day, Tommy." She watched him cycle off, her mind turning over this new piece of information. Mr. Weaver, the supposed historian, had arrived in St. Mary Mead shortly before Ellison's death, claiming an interest in local land records. His nervous demeanor when she had questioned him at the fete suggested he was more than he seemed. Could he be connected to the pact, or was he an outsider poking into matters best left alone? Either way, his inquiries about the land aligned too neatly with Dolly's gossip to be coincidence. She continued her walk, her pace slow but deliberate, her eyes taking in every detail: the uneven cobblestones, the fading roses in Mrs. Harris's garden, the faint tire marks in the mud near the manor's gate. The manor itself loomed at the end of the lane, its gabled roof stark against the gray sky. Mr. Ellison had been a private man, new to the village and not entirely trusted, though his wealth had ensured a grudging acceptance. His death had shaken St. Mary Mead, not out of affection, but because murder was a rare disruption in their quiet lives. Miss Marple paused at the gate, noting the drawn curtains and the absence of Clara's familiar figure in the garden. The girl was likely inside, scrubbing floors or tending to the new housekeeper, but Miss Marple made a mental note to call on her later. Clara's sharp eyes and timid trust made her a valuable ally. As she turned back toward home, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the pact. If Dolly's rumors were true, the land in question was likely the undeveloped plot bordering Ellison's estate, a parcel long coveted by developers for its proximity to the railway. Selling it would bring significant profit, but the village council had always resisted, citing its value as common land. A secret agreement to bypass public approval suggested greed, and greed, as Miss Marple knew well, was a powerful motive for murder. She recalled a case from years ago in Chipping Cleghorn, where a seemingly trivial dispute over inheritance had led to betrayal and death. The parallels were striking: hidden agreements, trusted figures turned treacherous, and a community blindsided by its own familiarity. By the time she reached her cottage, the morning had warmed slightly, and the scent of baking bread drifted from the village. Miss Marple settled back into her armchair. Her knitting resumed, but her mind was far from idle. The pact, if it existed, involved at least 3 players: Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and the late Mr. Ellison. Others might be complicit, perhaps, even unaware of the full extent of the scheme. Mr. Weaver's role remained unclear, but his interest in the land suggested he was either a threat to the pact or a part of it. And then there was Clara, whose innocent observations had already provided the first thread in this tangled web. Miss Marple's needles clicked faster, her thoughts weaving a pattern as intricate as her scarf. The afternoon brought a visitor, as she had hoped it might. Clara knocked timidly, her apron still damp from washing dishes. "Miss Marple, I didn't know who else to tell," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I found something in Mr. Ellison's study, a book, like a ledger, locked tight. I didn't dare open it, but I hid it under the loose floorboard in the pantry. It's got strange markings in it, not proper writing. I think it's important." Miss Marple's heart quickened, though her face remained calm. "You did well, Clara," she said gently. "Can you bring it to me tomorrow when it's safe? And say nothing to anyone, not even the other maids." Clara nodded, her eyes wide with trust, and scurried back to the manor. "Alone again, miss." Marple considered the ledger. Coded entries suggested secrecy, perhaps records of payments or agreements tied to the land deal. If it named names, it could confirm the pact and point to Ellison's killer. She thought of Dr. Haydock, whose medical knowledge gave him access to poisons, and Colonel Bantry, whose debts might have driven him to desperation. Even Mr. Weaver, with his evasive answers, could not be ruled out. The ledger was the key, and Miss Marple resolved to see it for herself. As evening fell, she lit the fire and settled into her chair, her knitting a steady companion. The village of St. Mary Mead slept quietly outside, unaware of the secrets it harbored. Miss Marple's sharp glance had caught the first glint of truth, and she would follow it, as she always did, until the pact was unraveled and justice restored. For now, she knitted and waited, knowing the ledger would bring her one step closer to the heart of the mystery. Chapter 8. The Hidden Ledger. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor. She sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of tea cooling on the small table beside her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she worked on a pale blue shawl. To an outsider, She might have appeared the picture of serene domesticity, an elderly spinster lost in her thoughts. But her sharp gray eyes, darting occasionally to the window, betrayed a mind at work, piecing together the threads of a mystery that had begun to unravel in St. Mary Mead. The village had been unsettled since Mr. Ellison's death 2 days prior. The police, led by Inspector Craddock, had cordoned off the manor, their boots tramping across its manicured lawns as they searched for clues. The official word was poison likely administered in the glass of port found shattered beside Ellison's body, but the motive remained elusive. The villagers whispered of accidents or suicide, but Miss Marple knew better. Her years of observing human nature, from the petty squabbles of St. Mary Mead to the darker impulses that lurked beneath polite facades, told her this was no accident. The cryptic note in the village gazette, hinting at a pact, and the strained interactions she had witnessed at the charity fete, pointed to something deeper, a conspiracy that had turned deadly. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. "Come in," she called, setting her knitting aside. The door creaked open, and Clara, the young housemaid from Ellison's manor, slipped inside. Her face was pale, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. "Miss Marple, I'm sorry to bother you so early," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I found something. I didn't know who else to turn to." Miss Marple gestured to the chair opposite her. "Sit down, Clara. You're trembling. Now, tell me what's happened." Clara perched on the edge of the seat, her eyes darting to the window as if expecting someone to be watching. It's a book, ma'am. A ledger, I think. I found it hidden in Mr. Ellison's study last night when I was cleaning. It was tucked behind a false panel in the bookshelf. I only noticed because one of the books was sticking out odd-like. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, though her expression remained calm. "A ledger, you say? Did you look inside it?" Clara nodded, her cheeks flushing. "I know I shouldn't have, but I was curious. It's full of numbers and names, but they're all in some sort of code. I couldn't make sense of it. I thought you might know what to do with it." "You did exactly the right thing, Clara," Miss Marple said, her voice soothing but firm. "Did anyone see you take it?" "No, ma'am. The other servants were in the kitchen, and the police had gone for the night. I wrapped it in a cloth and brought it straight here." Clara reached into her apron and produced a small leather-bound book, no larger than a diary. Its cover was worn, the edges frayed, and a faint smell of old paper clung to it. She handed it to Miss Marple, who took it with care, her fingers tracing the embossed initials R.E. On the front, Richard Ellison, no doubt. "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said. "This may be very important. You mustn't tell anyone you found it, not even the other servants. Do you understand?" Clara nodded vigorously. "I won't say a word, ma'am, but do you think it has to do with Mr. Ellison's death?" "I think it very likely," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle, but her mind already racing. "Now, go back to the manor and carry on as usual. If anyone asks, you've been to the market. And Clara, keep your eyes open, but be careful." Clara bobbed her head and slipped out, leaving Miss Marple alone with the ledger. She set her tea aside and opened the book, her fingers moving carefully as if handling a delicate piece of evidence. The pages were filled with neat, precise handwriting, but as Clara had said, the entries were cryptic. Names were abbreviated to initials the H.C.B. MP and numbers were listed in columns labeled with obscure terms like Parcel A and Return. Some entries were marked with dates, others with symbols, a cross, a circle, a triangle. It was a code, but not an impenetrable one. Miss Marple had seen such things before in the account books of unscrupulous shopkeepers or the private notes of village busybodies trying to hide their gossip. She closed the ledger and leaned back, her mind drifting to a memory of old Mrs. Trent, a widow who had once kept a coded diary to track her neighbors' debts. The key had been simple, a substitution cipher based on the first letter of each month. Miss Marple suspected something similar here, but she would need time to test her theory. For now, the initials stood out. DH could be Dr. Haydock, CB, was likely Colonel Bantry, and MP might be Miss Pollitt, Dr. Haydock's assistant. But what were they hiding? And why had Ellison, the apparent architect of this pact, ended up dead? The clock on the mantel struck 10, and Miss Marple rose, tucking the ledger into a drawer beneath a pile of knitting patterns. She would need to consult someone with a sharper eye for numbers. Perhaps Mr. Petherick, the retired solicitor who had a knack for unraveling financial tangles. But first, she decided to visit the manor herself. The police might have missed something in their search, and Miss Marple had a way of noticing details others overlooked. She donned her coat and hat, picked up her umbrella more for appearances. Then necessity, as the day was clear, and set out for Ellison's manor. The walk took her through the heart of St. Mary Mead, past the post office where Mrs. Price was gossiping with the postmistress, and the church where Reverend Clement was, tending the rose bushes. She nodded politely to each, her face a mask of pleasant neutrality. But her eyes took in everything, the way Mrs. Price's voice dropped when she mentioned the manor, the nervous glance Reverend Clement cast toward the village hall. The manor stood at the edge of the village, a grand Georgian structure surrounded by neatly trimmed hedges and a gravel drive. The police tape had been removed, but a constable stood at the gate, looking bored. Miss Marple approached with her usual disarming smile. "Good morning, Constable Reed. I was hoping to speak with Mrs. Baxter, the housekeeper. She promised me a recipe for her excellent scones." The constable, a young man who had once been scolded by Miss Marple for stealing apples as a boy, blushed slightly. "Of course, Miss Marple. The house is open again, though the study's still locked. Mrs. Baxter's inside." "Thank you, dear," she said, patting his arm as she passed. The gesture was calculated. It put him at ease, ensuring he wouldn't question her presence. Inside, the manor was quiet, the air heavy with the scent of polish and old wood. Mrs. Baxter, a stout woman with a perpetually harried expression, met her in the hall. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting you. Is it about the scones?" "Oh, yes," Miss Marple said, her tone light. "But I also wanted to offer my condolences about Mr. Ellison. Such a dreadful business. Might I see the study? I heard it's where the poor man was found, and I do like to pay my respects in my own way." Mrs. Baxter hesitated, then nodded. "The police are done with it, I suppose. But it's locked, and only Inspector Craddock has the key." "No matter," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "Perhaps you could show me the library instead." Mr. Ellison was so proud of his books. The housekeeper led her to the library, a large room lined with oak shelves and heavy furniture. Miss Marple's eyes scanned the space, noting the bookshelf where Clara had found the ledger. One shelf was slightly askew, the books misaligned as if someone had disturbed them. She moved closer, pretending to admire a volume of Dickens, and ran her fingers along the edge of the shelf. A faint click sounded, and a small panel swung open, revealing an empty compartment. "Oh my," Miss Marple said, feigning surprise. "What's this?" Mrs. Baxter gasped. "I had no idea that was there. Mr. Ellison was always so particular about his books. He never let anyone touch them." "Curious," Miss Marple murmured. "Perhaps the police should know about this." She made a mental note of the panel's mechanism, suspecting it had been used to hide more than just the ledger. As Mrs. Baxter chattered nervously, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a small desk in the corner. A single sheet of paper lay atop it, partially covered by a blotter. She edged closer, her movements casual, and glimpsed a list of names and numbers similar to those in the ledger, but uncoded. Before she could read more, Mrs. Baxter turned, and Miss Marple stepped back, smiling. "Thank you, Mrs. Baxter. I mustn't keep you. I'll come by for that recipe another day." As she left the manor, Miss Marple's mind buzzed with possibilities. The ledger, the hidden panel, the uncoded list, they all pointed to a financial scheme, likely tied to the village land Dolly Bantry had mentioned. But who stood to gain the most? And why had Ellison been killed? She recalled a case from years ago when a local farmer had been swindled out of his land by a forged deed. The parallels were striking, but she needed more evidence. Back at her cottage, Miss Marple retrieved the ledger and settled at her dining table with a pencil and notebook. She began by listing the initials from the ledger: D.H., C.B., M.P., and others she couldn't yet identify. The numbers beside them ranged from small sums to amounts in the thousands, labeled with terms like Parcel A and Return. She suspected parcel referred to plots of land and return to den, profits or bribes. The symbols cross, circle, triangle might indicate status, completed transactions, pending deals, or disputes. Chapter 9. The Historian's Secret. Morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead, cloaking the village in a silvery veil that softened the edges of the thatched cottages and the spire of St. Mary's Church. Jane Marple sat in her armchair by the window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she gazed out at the quiet street. The village seemed to hold its breath, as if aware of the secrets festering beneath its idyllic surface. Miss Marple's sharp eyes, undimmed by age, scanned the familiar scene, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over the puzzle of Mr. Ellison's death, the cryptic ledger, and the elusive Mr. Weaver, who called himself a historian but carried the nervous air of a man with something to hide. The previous day's discovery of the ledger had been a breakthrough. Clara, the young housemaid from Ellison's manor, had slipped it into Miss Marple's hands with a whispered warning to be careful. The leather-bound book, its pages filled with neat but coded entries, spoke of transactions, sums of money, dates, and initials that hinted at a conspiracy among the village council. Miss Marple had spent the evening poring over it, her nimble mind teasing out patterns. The initials H, B, and E appeared repeatedly, likely standing for Dr. Haydock, Colonel Bantry, and the late Mr. Ellison, but there were others unknown players, and the ledgers guarded. Language suggested a pact that went beyond mere financial dealings. What was it they were hiding? And why had Ellison, the linchpin of this scheme, been poisoned? Miss Marple's thoughts turned to Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian who had arrived in St. Mary Mead with a satchel full of books and a story that didn't quite add up. His questions about the manor's history had been too pointed, his manner too guarded. She recalled the way his eyes had darted when she'd casually mentioned that the village's old land disputes during tea at the vicarage. There was something about him, a flicker of unease, that reminded her of young Tommy Pierce, a village lad from years ago, who'd been caught pilfering from the church collection plate and had worn the same guilty look when questioned. Mr. Weaver was no thief, perhaps, but he was hiding something, and Miss Marple intended to find out what. She set her knitting aside and rose, smoothing her skirt. The village clock chimed 10, and she knew Mr. Weaver would be at the library, where he spent most mornings poring over dusty records. It was time for a conversation, not the gentle, meandering chat of a village spinster, but a careful, probing exchange that would coax the truth from him. Miss Marple donned her hat, picked up her umbrella, though the sky was clear, and stepped out into the mist. The library was a small, stone building at the edge of the village green, its shelves crammed with books that smelled of mildew and time. Miss Marple found Mr. Weaver at a corner table, surrounded by maps and ledgers, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. He looked up as she approached, his expression a mix of surprise and wariness. "Good morning, Mr. Weaver," she said brightly, settling into a chair across from him. "I see you're deep in your research. The history of St. Mary Mead must be fascinating." He adjusted his glasses, his fingers twitching slightly. "Oh, yes, Miss Marple, quite fascinating. The land records here go back centuries. I'm tracing the ownership of the manor estate." "Indeed," she said, her voice light but her eyes keen. "The manor has always been a point of interest. Such a grand old place, full of secrets. I imagine you found some intriguing details." Mr. Weaver hesitated, his gaze flickering to the papers before him. "Well, it's mostly routine deeds, transfers, that sort of thing. Nothing out of the ordinary." Miss Marple tilted her head, her smile disarming. "Oh, come now, Mr. Weaver. A man of your expertise surely notices when something is amiss. I've always found that history has a way of revealing secrets even those people think are well hidden. Like that business with the old vicarage years ago when a forged deed nearly cost the church its land. You remind me a bit of the surveyor who uncovered that little scandal." His face paled slightly, and he busied himself with a map, smoothing its edges. "I'm not sure I follow, Miss Marple. I'm just here for the records. Of course," she said, her tone gentle but unrelenting. "But you see, I couldn't help noticing how interested you are in Mr. Ellison's manor. And with his tragic death, one does wonder if there's more to your visit than old deeds. Perhaps you've heard something about a certain agreement?" Mr. Weaver's hand froze on the map, and for a moment the library was silent save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Miss Marple watched him closely, noting the tightening of his jaw, the slight tremor in his fingers. She had seen that look before on Mrs. Clement's nephew, who'd tried to cover up a youthful indiscretion with a stammered excuse. Mr. Weaver was no boy, but he was cornered, and she knew it. "Miss Marple," he said at last, his voice low, "you're a perceptive woman. I suppose there's no point in pretending. I'm not just a historian." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "I thought as much. Would you care to tell me who you really are, Mr. Weaver? Or shall I guess?" He sighed, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. "You don't miss much, do you? All right. My name is Weaver, but I'm not here for academic research. I'm a private investigator hired by Mr. Grayson, the owner of the neighboring estate in Chipping Cleggan. He suspected Ellison was involved in something shady, a deal to sell off village land for development against the council's public stance. Grayson wanted proof before it went too far." Miss Marple nodded, her expression unchanged but her mind racing. "And this deal, this pact, did it involve others in the village? Dr. Haydock, perhaps? Or Colonel Bantry?" Weaver's eyes widened, and he leaned closer, his voice barely a whisper. "You've seen the ledger, haven't you?" "Yes, they're involved." Ellison was the ringleader, but Haydock and Bantry were in on it, along with a few others. The plan was to sell a parcel of village land to a developer for a tidy profit, splitting the proceeds. They masked it as a conservation project, but the ledger tells the real story. "And Mr. Ellison's death?" she prompted, her voice soft but insistent. Weaver swallowed hard, glancing around the empty library. "I think he was killed because he wanted out. He was getting cold feet, talking about confessing to the village. Someone didn't want that to happen. And now," he paused, his face drawn, "I'm afraid I might be next. I've been asking too many questions, getting too close." Miss Marple sat back, her mind piecing together the puzzle. Weaver's confession confirmed her suspicions about the ledger and the pact, but it also raised new questions. If Ellison had been killed to protect the secret, who had the most to lose? Dr. Haydock, with his respected position and ambition? Colonel Bantry, whose financial troubles were no secret in the village? Or someone else, lurking in the shadows of St. Mary Mead? "You've been very brave, Mr. Weaver," she said at last, her tone kind but firm. "But also very foolish. Stirring up a hornet's nest without protection is dangerous. I'd advise you to stay in public places and avoid wandering alone, especially at night. And perhaps leave the ledger with someone you trust." He nodded, his shoulders sagging with relief at unburdening himself. "You're right. I've been careless. But what about you, Miss Marple? You're poking around in this too. Aren't you worried?" She smiled, her eyes twinkling with a quiet confidence. "Oh, I'm just an old lady who likes to knit and chat. No one pays much attention to me. But I do appreciate your concern." They parted ways, Mr. Weaver promising to be more cautious and Miss Marple promising to keep his secret for now. As she walked home through the lifting mist, her mind was alight with possibilities. Weaver's revelation had confirmed the pact's existence, but it also deepened the mystery. If Ellison had been killed to silence him, the murderer was someone close to the pact, someone with access to poison and a motive to protect their share. And then there was Miss Pollitt, Dr. Haydock's assistant, lying unconscious in the hospital after her accident. Was she another loose end, like Ellison? Back at her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her armchair and picked up her knitting, the needles resuming their steady rhythm. She thought of Clara, the housemaid, who had been so frightened when she delivered the ledger. Clara had mentioned seeing Dr. Haydock at the manor late at night, a detail that now seemed significant. And Colonel Bantry, with his blustering charm and mounting debts, could he have been desperate enough to kill? Miss Marple's mind drifted to a parallel from her youth, a village grocer who'd poisoned his partner over a disputed loan, all because of greed and fear of exposure. People, she mused, were much the same everywhere. The ledger lay hidden in her sewing basket, its secrets safe for now. She would need to study it further, cross-referencing the coded entries with village records. But first, she needed to speak to Clara again to confirm the details of those late-night visits. And she would keep an eye on Mr. Weaver, who was now a target as much as a witness. The village of St. Mary Mead, with its quaint cottages and friendly faces, was a place of secrets. And Miss Marple knew that her sharp glance was the key to unraveling them. Chapter 10. A second tragedy. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead like a delicate shawl, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the otherwise familiar landscape. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she gazed out at the damp street. The events of the past week had unsettled the village, and the discovery of Mr. Ellison's body in his study, the metallic tang of poison lingering in the air, had cast a pall over the community. The police, under Inspector Craddock's steady hand, were combing through statements and alibis, but Miss Marple's sharp mind was already piecing together fragments of a puzzle that felt tantalizingly close to completion. Yet, as she pondered the ledger's coded entries and the cryptic behavior of Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian, a new disturbance was about to ripple through St. Mary Mead. The village clock struck 9, its chime echoing faintly across the green. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the hurried patter of footsteps on the cobblestone path leading to her cottage. She set her knitting aside, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she recognized the silhouette of young Clara, the housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor, through the lace curtains. Clara's face was pale, her apron slightly askew, and her breath came in quick gasps as she knocked urgently on the door. "Come in." "Clara, do," Miss Marple called, rising with her usual unhurried grace. The door swung open, and Clara stumbled. Inside, her eyes wide with panic. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful." Clara clutched her hands together, twisting the fabric of her apron. "It's Miss Pollitt, Dr. Haydock's assistant. She's been found unconscious at the bottom of the surgery stairs. They're saying she fell, but I don't believe it, not after everything." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her mind was racing. Miss Pollitt, a quiet, efficient woman in her 30s, had been a peripheral figure in the unfolding mystery, always hovering near Dr. Haydock with her clipboard and precise manner. But Miss Marple had noticed her. At the charity fete, her eyes darting nervously when Mr. Ellison's name was mentioned. Could she have overheard something about the secret pact? Or worse, had she become a threat to someone desperate to keep it hidden? "Sit down, Clara, and tell me everything," Miss Marple said, guiding the girl to a cushioned chair by the hearth. She poured a small glass of elderberry wine from a decanter, a remedy for nerves, she always said, and handed it to Clara, who took it with trembling hands. "It was this morning, just after dawn," Clara began, her voice unsteady. "I was passing the surgery on my way to the manor when I saw a crowd gathering. Mrs. Price was there, and Mr. Clements from the post office, and they were all whispering. Miss Pollitt was lying at the foot of the stairs, her head bleeding, and Dr. Haydock was kneeling beside her, calling for someone to fetch the ambulance. They're saying she tripped, but—" Miss Marple, Those stairs are wide and sturdy. I've been up and down them myself when I had that cough last winter." "It doesn't." "Makes sense." Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursed. "And what did Dr. Haydock say about her condition?" "He said she'd hit her head badly and was unconscious but breathing. The ambulance took her to St. Luke's Hospital in Much Benham, but, Miss Marple, I saw something odd. There was a bit of paper clutched in her hand, like she'd been holding it when she fell. Nobody else seemed to notice, but I saw it before Dr. Haydock tucked it into his pocket." "A piece of paper?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "Did you see what was on it?" Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am, it was crumpled, and I was too far away. But it looked like a note, maybe torn from a notebook. And Dr. Haydock, he looked frightened, I'd say. Not just worried, like a doctor would be, but scared." Miss Marple leaned back, her fingers steepled. Dr. Haydock, a respected figure in St. Mary Mead, had been one of the council members implicated in the secret pact, according to the rumors Dolly Bantry had shared. His ambition was no secret. He'd often spoken of modernizing the village, building a new clinic, perhaps even running for a county position. But fear? That suggested something deeper, something personal. Miss Marple recalled a case from years ago, in the neighboring village of Chipping Cleghorn, where a doctor's ambition had masked a ruthless streak. Could Dr. Haydock be hiding a similar flaw? "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said gently. "You've done right to tell me. Now you mustn't speak of this to anyone else, not yet. Go back to the manor, and if you hear anything more, come straight to me." Clara nodded, her face still pale but steadier now. "I will, Miss Marple. I trust you." As Clara left, Miss Marple returned to her window, her mind sifting through the new information. A second tragedy, so soon after Mr. Ellison's death, was no coincidence. The village was small, its rhythms predictable, and two such incidents suggested a deliberate hand. She thought of the ledger, now safely hidden in her sewing basket, its coded entries pointing to a conspiracy among the council members to profit from a land deal. Miss Pollitt's fall, if it was not an accident, indicated that someone was desperate to keep the pact a secret. And Dr. Haydock's frightened expression, as described by Clara, was a thread worth pulling. Miss Marple decided to visit the surgery herself. She donned her black felt hat, adjusted her shawl, and picked up her sturdy walking stick, more for appearance than necessity. The village surgery was a short walk from her cottage, past the vicarage and the green, where children were playing. Despite the morning's grim news, as she approached, she saw Mrs. Price, the village gossip, lingering near the surgery gate, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her tone pleasant but firm. "Such a shock about poor Miss Pollitt. Have you heard how she's faring?" Mrs. Price, ever eager to share, stepped closer. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. They say she's still unconscious, and the doctors at St. Luke's aren't sure she'll pull through. A fall, they're calling it, but I've my doubts. Those stairs are as safe as houses. And Miss Pollitt, she's not the clumsy sort, is she?" "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes scanning the surgery's front door. "And Dr. Haydock, how is he bearing up?" Mrs. Price lowered her voice, though there was no one else nearby. "He's been in and out all morning, looking like he's seen a ghost." Sod, he's canceling his appointments today to visit the hospital. But between you and me, Miss Marple, he's been acting queer ever since Mr. Ellison's death. Always rushing about, muttering to himself. Miss Marple nodded, filing away the observation. Thank you, Mrs. Price. I'll pop in to see if Dr. Haydock needs anything. These are trying times. She entered the surgery, the bell above the door jingling softly. The waiting room was empty, the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic and wax polish. Dr. Haydock was at the reception desk, sorting through papers with a distracted air. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his face pale but composed. Miss Marple, he said, managing a smile. What brings you here? Not feeling unwell, I hope? Oh, no, doctor, she replied, her voice light. I heard about poor Miss Pollitt and thought I'd see if there's anything I can do. Such a shock for the village. Dr. Haydock's smile faltered. Yes, a terrible accident. She must have missed her step in the early light. I found her myself, you know, when I arrived this morning. She's at St. Luke's now, and we're all praying for her recovery. Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. How dreadful for you, finding her like that. And so soon after Mr. Ellison's passing. It does make one wonder if there's a connection, doesn't it? Dr. Haydock's hand froze on the papers, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. A connection? He said, his voice tight. I don't see how. Ellison's death was a tragedy, likely poisoning, as the police suspect. But Miss Pollitt's fall was just an accident. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. Though it's curious, isn't it, how accidents seem to cluster. I remember a case in St. Mary Mead years ago when a series of mishaps turned out to be quite deliberate, but I'm sure you're right. Still, I wonder if Miss Pollitt might have seen or heard something that troubled her. She was always so observant. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his fingers tightening on the pen he held. She was a good assistant, always diligent. But I don't think she was involved in anything untoward. Now, if you'll excuse me. Miss Marple, I must prepare to visit the hospital. Miss Marple smiled, undeterred by his dismissal. Of course, doctor. Do give my regards to Miss Pollitt when she wakes. And if you find that note she was holding, it might be worth a look. Sometimes the smallest things hold the biggest secrets. Dr. Haydock's face drained of color, and Miss Marple knew she'd struck a nerve. She left the surgery, her mind buzzing. The note Clara had mentioned was a loose thread, and Dr. Haydock's reaction confirmed its importance. But what had Miss Pollitt known, and why had someone, perhaps Dr. Haydock himself, felt the need to silence her? Chapter 10. A second tragedy. The morning mist clung to the hedgerows of St. Mary Mead like a delicate shawl, softening the edges of the village's stone cottages and lending an air of quiet mystery to the otherwise familiar landscape. Miss Jane Marple sat by her parlor window, her knitting needles clicking rhythmically as she gazed out at the damp street. The events of the past week had unsettled the village, and the discovery of Mr. Ellison's body in his study, the metallic tang of poison lingering in the air, had cast a pall over the community. The police, under Inspector Craddock's steady hand, were combing through statements and alibis, but Miss Marple's sharp mind was already piecing together fragments of a puzzle that felt tantalizingly close to completion. Yet, as she pondered, The ledger's coded entries and the cryptic behavior of Mr. Weaver, the so-called historian. A new disturbance was about to ripple through St. Mary Mead. The village clock struck 9, its chime echoing faintly across the green. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the hurried patter of footsteps on the cobblestone path leading to her cottage. She set her knitting aside, her pale blue eyes narrowing as she recognized the silhouette of young Clara, the housemaid from Mr. Ellison's manor, through the lace curtains. Clara's face was pale, her apron slightly askew, and her breath came in quick gasps as she knocked urgently on the door. "Come in." "Clara, do," Miss Marple called, rising with her usual unhurried grace. The door swung open, and Clara stumbled. Inside, her eyes wide with panic. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful." Clara clutched her hands together, twisting the fabric of her apron. "It's Miss Pollitt, Dr. Haydock's assistant. She's been found unconscious at the bottom of the surgery stairs. They're saying she fell, but I don't believe it, not after everything." Miss Marple's expression remained calm, though her mind was racing. Miss Pollitt, a quiet, efficient woman in her 30s, had been a peripheral figure in the unfolding mystery, always hovering near Dr. Haydock with her clipboard and precise manner. But Miss Marple had noticed her. At the charity fête, her eyes darting nervously when Mr. Ellison's name was mentioned. Could she have overheard something about the secret pact? Or worse, had she become a threat to someone desperate to keep it hidden? "Sit down, Clara, and tell me everything," Miss Marple said, guiding the girl to a cushioned chair by the hearth. She poured a small glass of elderberry wine from a decanter, a remedy for nerves, she always said, and handed it to Clara, who took it with trembling hands. "It was this morning, just after dawn," Clara began, her voice unsteady. "I was passing the surgery on my way to the manor when I saw a crowd gathering. Mrs. Price was there, and Mr. Clements from the post office, and they were all whispering. Miss Pollitt was lying at the foot of the stairs, her head bleeding, and Dr. Haydock was kneeling beside her, calling for someone to fetch the ambulance. They're saying she tripped, but, Miss Marple, those stairs are wide and sturdy. I've been up and down them myself when I had that cough last winter. It doesn't make sense." Miss Marple nodded, her lips pursed. "And what did Dr. Haydock say about her condition?" "He said she'd hit her head badly and was unconscious but breathing. The ambulance took her to St. Luke's Hospital in Much Benham. But, Miss Marple, I saw something odd. There was a bit of paper clutched in her hand, like she'd been holding it when she fell. Nobody else seemed to notice, but I saw it before Dr. Haydock tucked it into his pocket. A piece of paper?" Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with interest. "Did you see what was on it?" Clara shook her head. "No, ma'am, it was crumpled, and I was too far away. But it looked like a note, maybe torn from a notebook. And Dr. Haydock, he looked frightened, I'd say. Not just worried, like a doctor would be, but scared." Miss Marple leaned back, her fingers steepled. Dr. Haydock, a respected figure in St. Mary Mead, had been one of the council members implicated in the secret pact, according to the rumors Dolly Bantry had shared. His ambition was no secret. He'd often spoken of modernizing the village, building a new clinic, perhaps even running for a county position. But fear? That suggested something deeper, something personal. Miss Marple recalled a case from years ago, in the neighboring village of Chipping Cleghorn, where a doctor's ambition had masked a ruthless streak. Could Dr. Haydock be hiding a similar flaw? "Thank you, Clara," Miss Marple said gently. "You've done right to tell me. Now, you mustn't speak of this to anyone else, not yet. Go back to the manor, and if you hear anything more, come straight to me." Clara nodded, her face still pale but steadier now. "I will, Miss Marple. I trust you." As Clara left Miss Marple returned to her window, her mind sifting through the new information. A second tragedy, so soon after Mr. Ellison's death, was no coincidence. The village was small, its rhythms predictable, and two such incidents suggested a deliberate hand. She thought of the ledger, now safely hidden in her sewing basket, its coded entries pointing to a conspiracy among the council members to profit from a land deal. Miss Pollitt's fall, if it was not an accident, indicated that someone was desperate to keep the pact a secret. And Dr. Haydock's frightened expression, as described by Clara, was a thread worth pulling. Miss Marple decided to visit the surgery herself. She donned her black felt hat, adjusted her shawl, and picked up her sturdy walking stick, more for appearance than necessity. The village surgery was a short walk from her cottage, past the vicarage and the green, where children were playing. Despite the morning's grim news, as she approached, she saw Mrs. Price, the village gossip, lingering near the surgery gate, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Good morning, Mrs. Price," Miss Marple said, her tone pleasant but firm. "Such a shock about poor Miss Pollitt. Have you heard how she's faring?" Mrs. Price, ever eager to share, stepped closer. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful. They say she's still unconscious, and the doctors at St. Luke's aren't sure. She'll pull through. A fall, they're calling it, but I've my doubts. Those stairs are as safe as houses. And Miss Pollitt, she's not the clumsy sort, is she?" "No, indeed," Miss Marple agreed, her eyes scanning the surgery's front door. "And Dr. Haydock, how is he bearing up?" Mrs. Price lowered her voice, though there was no one else nearby. "He's been in and out all morning, looking like he's seen a ghost. Said he's canceling his appointments today to visit the hospital. But between you and me, Miss Marple, he's been acting queer ever since Mr. Ellison's death. Always rushing about, muttering to himself." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the observation. "Thank you, Mrs. Price. I'll pop in to see if Dr. Haydock needs anything. These are trying times." She entered the surgery, the bell above the door jingling softly. The waiting room was empty, the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic and wax polish. Dr. Haydock was at the reception desk, sorting through papers with a distracted air. He looked up as Miss Marple approached, his face pale but composed. "Miss Marple," he said, managing a smile. "What brings you here? Not feeling unwell, I hope?" "Oh, no, doctor," she replied, her voice light. "I heard about poor Miss Pollitt and thought I'd see if there's anything I can do." Such a shock for the village. Dr. Haydock's smile faltered. "Yes, a terrible accident. She must have missed her step in the early light. I found her myself, when I arrived this morning. She's at St. Luke's now, and we're all praying for her recovery." Miss Marple tilted her head, her eyes soft but piercing. "How dreadful for you, finding her like that. And so soon after Mr. Ellison's passing. It does make one wonder if there's a connection, doesn't it?" Dr. Haydock's hand froze on the papers, and for a moment Miss Marple thought she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "A connection?" he said, his voice tight. I don't see how. Ellison's death was a tragedy, likely poisoning, as the police suspect. But Miss Pollitt's fall was just an accident. Of course, Miss Marple said, her tone soothing. Though it's curious, isn't it, how accidents seem to cluster. I remember a case in St. Mary Mead years ago when a series of mishaps turned out to be quite deliberate, but I'm sure you're right. Still, I wonder if Miss Pollitt might have seen or heard something that troubled her. She was always so observant. Dr. Haydock cleared his throat, his fingers tightening on the pen he held. She was a good assistant, always diligent. But I don't think she was involved in anything untoward. Now, if you'll excuse me. Miss Marple, I must prepare to visit the hospital. Miss Marple smiled, undeterred by his dismissal. Of course, doctor. Do give my regards to Miss Pollitt when she wakes. And if you find that note she was holding, it might be worth a look. Sometimes the smallest things hold the biggest secrets. Dr. Haydock's face drained of color, and Miss Marple knew she'd struck a nerve. She left the surgery, her mind buzzing. The note Clara had mentioned was a loose thread, and Dr. Haydock's reaction confirmed its importance. But what had Miss Pollitt known, and why had someone, perhaps Dr. Haydock himself, felt the need to silence her?